Deep in America's wilderness, park rangers stand watch over ancient forests, where folklore becomes reality, and the creatures of legend still roam in the dark. I never planned to become a park ranger in Alaska. The path that led me to Denali National Park was as winding as the rivers that carve through its vast wilderness. After years trapped in a corporate job that drained my spirit, the opportunity arrived like an answer to a question I hadn't fully formed. The posting called for someone willing to brave isolation, harsh winters, and minimal contact with the outside world. Perfect. The ranger station sat on the edge of Lake Taltan, a body of water so still and clear it mirrored the mountains with perfect precision. My cabin, a sturdy log structure built in the 1970s, perched on a small rise overlooking both the lake and the dense forest that stretched beyond sight. They called this outpost Aklark Station, an ancient Inuit word meaning brown bear. How unfortunate that name would prove to be. "It gets lonely out here," Ranger Moss told me on my first day, his weathered face creasing into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Most folks last a season, maybe two. The silence gets to them." I assured him the silence was exactly what I sought. What I didn't tell him was about the nightmares, the persistent feeling of being watched that had plagued me in the city. Something about this wilderness called to me, promised answers, or perhaps forgiveness. "Well, your primary responsibility is tracking wildlife patterns and assisting lost hikers," he continued, handing me a thick manual. "We get about 8 search and rescue operations each summer. Winter, you'll mainly be monitoring for poachers and collecting climate data." I nodded, pretending the isolation didn't thrill me. 6 months alone with only periodic radio check-ins and monthly supply drops. Heaven. "One more thing," Moss said, pausing at the door of my cabin. "Don't go beyond Raven Ridge after dark. The terrain gets treacherous and we've had," he hesitated, "incidents." That first night alone at a Clark station introduced me to true darkness, the kind that swallows everything, rendering even your hand invisible before your face. The cabin creaked and settled around me, while wind whispered through pine boughs outside. I stepped onto the porch, breathing in air so crisp it burned my lungs. The stars formed a brilliant canopy overhead, more numerous than I'd ever seen. The Milky Way cut a swath across the night sky, and for the first time in years, I felt peace. A howl broke the silence, not a wolf, something deeper, more resonant. It echoed across the lake, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but then it came again, longer this time, with an almost mournful quality that raised goosebumps along my arms. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Night check-in, everything all right at Aklark?" The voice belonged to Kaya, the dispatcher at headquarters. "Yes," I responded, my voice strained. "All good. Just some strange animal sounds." "Probably wolverines," she replied casually. "They make the damnedest noises. Get some rest. You've got your first patrol tomorrow." Sleep came fitfully that night, my dreams filled with shadowy figures moving just beyond my vision. Morning revealed Denali's splendor. Mountains towered against a cloudless sky while the lake reflected perfect symmetry. I hiked the Eastern Trail, documenting wildlife signs as trained. I spotted moose tracks, identified droppings from snowshoe hares, and photographed a wolf print beside the stream. 3 days passed without incident. I settled into a routine morning patrols, afternoon data collection, evenings by the radio logging findings. The rhythm of nature became mine. I felt myself unwinding, the tightness in my chest loosening. Then I found the tracks. They appeared overnight near my cabin, massive impressions in the soft earth, each nearly 18 inches long. Human-like but impossibly large, with 5 distinct toes and a depth that suggested tremendous weight. I photographed them meticulously, measuring each one. The radio offered no comfort. "Probably just a bear walking funny," Kaya suggested. "Sometimes they step in their own tracks, makes them look bigger." "I know bear tracks," I insisted. "These are bipedal." Silence hummed through the static before she responded. "Document it in your report, probably nothing." But I knew it wasn't nothing. Something had circled my cabin while I slept, something heavy enough to leave half-inch depressions in packed soil. That night I heard it again, that guttural howl across the lake, closer this time. I stood at the window, straining to see movement in the tree line. The floodlight illuminated only the first few yards of forest edge, beyond which darkness reigned absolute. A branch snapped somewhere in that darkness, then another. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, stepping onto the porch against my better judgment. The beam cut through darkness, but revealed nothing unusual. Just as I turned to go back inside, movement caught my eye. Something tall and dark, shifting between trees, too quick to identify before it disappeared. Back inside, I double-checked the locks and loaded my rifle. That night, I pushed the heavy wooden table against the door and kept the light on. The journal entry from that evening reads, Day 5 at Clark Station. Something is watching the cabin. Park Services never mentioned large predators exhibiting this behavior. The tracks suggest bipedal movement of something at least 8 feet tall. Tomorrow, I'll set up the trail camera and contact headquarters about increased bear activity in the area. No sense alarming them with speculation. I didn't mention the distinct feeling that whatever left those tracks wasn't a bear. Nor did I mention how, just before dawn, something heavy moved across my roof, causing the entire cabin to creak under its weight. My first rescue operation came the next day, a family of 4 who'd wandered off the main trail and become disoriented. Finding them was straightforward. They'd only traveled 3 miles from their starting point. Their wide-eyed relief at seeing my uniform quickly shifted to nervous glances at the forest around us. "Did you hear it too?" the youngest child asked as I led them back toward the trailhead. "Hear what?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "The monkey man," she whispered. "He was following us, making noises." Her father shushed her quickly. "It was just the wind, honey. Rangers don't need to hear about your imagination." But something in his tight expression told me he'd heard it too. The trail cameras captured nothing but swaying branches and the occasional fox. Whatever had left those tracks around my cabin seemed to know exactly where I'd placed the cameras. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I began to wonder if perhaps stress and isolation had magnified normal forest sounds into something sinister. June slipped into July. The midnight sun meant darkness never fully descended, just a few hours of deep twilight before dawn crept back. This constant light should have been reassuring, but somehow it made the shadows deeper, more pronounced. I settled into patrol routines, mapping the region's features and learning its moods. The forest had personality. Certain sections felt welcoming, filled with birdsong and dappled light. Others remained perpetually gloomy, with dense canopies blocking sunlight and an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. Raven Ridge was the worst. Despite Moss's warning about avoiding it after dark, my patrol route occasionally took me along its northern face during daylight hours. Each time that feeling of being watched intensified. The trees grew thicker there, ancient giants that had witnessed centuries pass. Their twisted forms seemed to follow my movement, branches reaching like gnarled fingers. The incident with the lost hikers happened during my 3rd month. A group of college students had attempted to summit the ridge despite warnings about unstable terrain. Their distress call came just after noon. One had fallen, possibly broken his leg. I packed emergency supplies and headed out, radioing my coordinates to Kaya every 30 minutes. The trail to Raven Ridge wound through increasingly dense forest until it began its steep ascent. By the time I reached the students, the sun hung low, casting long shadows. "Thank God," one of them called when she spotted me. "We thought no one was coming." There were 4 of them huddled around their injured friend. His leg wasn't broken, just badly sprained, but he couldn't walk unassisted. I administered first aid and helped him to his feet. "We need to move quickly," I told them. "It's 3 hours back to the station, and we don't want to be on this ridge after sunset." "Why?" one of the boys asked. "What happens after sunset?" I didn't answer, just urged them onward. We'd made it halfway down when we heard it, that deep, resonant howl echoing across the valley. The students froze. "What was that?" the injured one whispered. "Probably a wolf," I lied. "Let's keep moving." But it came again, closer this time, followed by 3 distinct knocks, wood on wood, too rhythmic to be natural. "That's not a wolf," the tallest student said, panic edging his voice. Keep moving, I ordered, no longer bothering to hide my urgency. The forest darkened rapidly as clouds rolled in. We were still over an hour from the station when I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects. Just our labored breathing and the occasional whimper from the injured student. "Something's following us," one of the girls whispered. "In the trees to the left." I didn't look. Looking, acknowledged it. "Just focus on moving forward," I instructed, adjusting my grip on the rifle slung across my back. The knocking started again. 3 distinct sounds, then silence. 3 more, closer this time. Something large moved parallel to our path, just beyond visual range. Branches cracked under significant weight. "If we run, can we make it?" the tall student asked. "No," I said firmly. "We stay together, keep moving steadily. If we run, we might get separated. Or it might chase us," I didn't add. The attack, when it came, was not what I expected. No charging beast or obvious threat, just a massive rock that crashed onto the trail before us, followed by another behind us. They missed us by yards, but effectively trapped our group in a 20-foot section of trail. I unslung my rifle, scanning the slope above. Movement caught my eye, something large and dark sliding between trees with unnatural speed. Not a bear. Bears don't move like that. "What do we do?" one of the students pleaded. The decision came instantly. We leave the trail, head straight downhill toward the lake. It's steeper, but it'll get us to open ground faster. We half-carried the injured student as we crashed through underbrush, slipping on pine needles and loose soil. Behind us, something large paralleled our descent, moving far more gracefully through the forest than we could. When we reached the lake shore, I finally saw it clearly, just for a moment as it moved between 2 distant trees, tall, at least 8 feet, covered in dark fur, walking upright with a fluid, rolling gait that no human could mimic. It stopped when it realized we were watching, melting into the forest shadow with impossible stealth for something so large. We made it back to the station just as true darkness fell. I radioed headquarters, reporting the incident as an aggressive wildlife encounter, without specifics. The students, however, had no such reservations. "It was Bigfoot," the injured one insisted, as a medical helicopter prepared to evacuate him. "I saw it clearly when it threw those rocks." "Stress and fear can make us see strange things," I offered weakly. He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "You saw it too. I watched your face. You know what's out there." After they left, I stood on my porch watching the forest edge. The floodlights created a barrier of illumination, beyond which the darkness seemed thicker than normal. Throughout the night, the knocking continued. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, sometimes near, sometimes distant, as if something was circling the cabin. In my journal that night, I wrote what I couldn't say in my official report. There is something intelligent in these woods, something that uses tools, plans, ambushes, and communicates through sound. Park authorities either don't know or won't acknowledge its existence. The tracks match descriptions of what cryptozoologists call Sasquatch. But this feels like an inadequate label for what I witnessed today. This creature displayed reasoning, strategy, and territorial behavior beyond animal instinct. I should request transfer, but I need to know more. August brought shorter days and the first hint of autumn chill. Headquarters sent a research team to investigate the rock slide incident, finding nothing but confirming that no natural rock formation existed above that section of trail. Their report concluded with a recommendation to close the Raven Ridge Trail pending geological survey. I didn't tell them about the gifts that began appearing on my porch. The first was a perfectly arranged pile of blueberries placed on the top step one morning. I assumed it was left by a raven until I noticed the pattern, 3 distinct rows. The next day, a freshly killed rabbit. The third day, a complex arrangement of twigs forming what looked like a map, with a small stone placed precisely where my cabin would be. These offerings coincided with changes in the knocking pattern at night. No longer 3 simple taps, but complex rhythms that almost seemed like language. Sometimes I heard responses from far across the lake, different patterns, different tones. They were communicating, and I was living in the middle of their conversation. My radio calls to headquarters became less frequent. What could I tell them? that I believed a community of unclassified primates was trying to communicate, that I'd begun leaving my own offerings, packets of dried fruit and nuts, which disappeared by morning. The isolation that once comforted me now felt dangerous. I began logging events in coded language in my journal. Entity A continued nocturnal vocalization. Entity B responded from northeast quadrant. Evidence suggests at least 3 distinct individuals using call and response patterns. Rock formations on West Shore displayed signs of deliberate arrangement. Found hair samples on broken branch approximately 7 feet above ground. I collected the hair-long, coarse strands, unlike any known wildlife in the region, and sealed it in a sample bag. Part of me wanted to send it for analysis, but another part, growing stronger daily, wanted to protect whatever secret lived in these woods. September brought the first snow to higher elevations. My supply drop included winter equipment, and noticed that the seasonal closing of outlying stations would begin in 6 weeks. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt a strange reluctance to leave. The encounter that changed everything happened during a routine patrol near an old trapper's cabin 3 miles from my station. The structure had collapsed years ago, but hikers occasionally used the clearing as a campsite. I checked it monthly for fire hazards or signs of poaching. That day, I found footprints in the light dusting of snow, my own approaching from the south, and something else's retreating north. Massive, barefoot impressions with 5 distinct toes, each track nearly 18 inches long. They hadn't been there when I arrived. Something had watched me inspect the site, then departed when I moved deeper into the ruins. I followed the tracks, against all protocol and common sense. They led through increasingly dense forest, areas no hiking trail penetrated. After a mile, I reached a stream crossing where the tracks vanished. Looking across, I saw nothing but untouched forest. Then I smelled it, a powerful musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not the rot of carrion or the ammonia scent of predator urine, but something distinctly primate yet foreign. "I know you're watching," I called out, surprising myself. "I'm not here to harm you." The forest absorbed my words without echo. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. The silence felt expectant, as if the entire woodland held its breath. Movement registered in my peripheral vision, something massive shifting behind a cluster of evergreens. I turned slowly, deliberately keeping my hands visible and away from my sidearm. It stood partly concealed by branches, but there was no mistaking its form. At least 8 feet tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark brown fur that reddened slightly at the shoulders. Its face remained in shadow, but I could make out the gleam of eyes watching me with unmistakable intelligence. We regarded each other for what felt like eternity. Neither threatening, neither retreating. A moment of recognition between 2 species that weren't supposed to meet. Then it raised one massive hand, palm forward, a gesture so human it stole my breath. Slowly, I mirrored the action, raising my own hand. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, breaking the moment. When I looked back, the figure had vanished, leaving nothing but swaying branches. That night, the knocking came directly from the tree line near my cabin, complex patterns that repeated 3 times. On impulse, I took a wooden spoon and knife from the kitchen and stepped onto the porch, tapping out the same rhythm against the railing. Silence followed, so profound I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, from the darkness, came a response. My pattern repeated exactly, followed by 3 new sounds. They were teaching me their language. My journal entries from those weeks reveal my deteriorating professional detachment. Day 112. Communication attempts continue. Entity now approaches within 50 yards of cabin during daylight hours. Have identified 3 distinct individuals based on height, coloration, and behavior patterns. The largest, designated Alpha, appears to be the group leader and primary communicator. The smallest, designated Gamma, shows the most curiosity, often staying to observe after others retreat. Day 117. Found complex arrangement of stones and branches 100 yards from cabin. Structure appears to indicate direction toward a specific mountain valley, not on any hiking trails. Deliberate communication or projection of my own desires for contact? Increasingly difficult to maintain objective analysis. Day 120. Decision made. Tomorrow I follow the stone markers. If I'm not back in 48 hours, this journal should provide headquarters with explanation for my absence. I believe they are inviting me into their territory. I believe they trust me. That night, as I packed supplies for what might be a one-way journey, the radio crackled to life. A. Clark Station, this is headquarters. Weather system moving in faster than expected. All outlying stations ordered to evacuate within 24 hours. Acknowledge. I stared at the radio, the weight of decision heavy upon me. Outside, the knocking continued, urgent now, almost pleading. A. Clark Station, acknowledge evacuation order. My hand hovered over the transmit button. A. Clark Station, acknowledging, I finally responded, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Will prepare for evacuation. The lie came easily. I had no intention of leaving, not yet. The stone markers pointed to something important, something the creatures wanted me to see. One day's journey couldn't hurt, I reasoned. I could always return for evacuation tomorrow. Dawn brought heavy gray skies and the metallic smell of approaching snow. I left a note pinned to the cabin door, explaining I was checking trail conditions before evacuation, then shouldered my pack and followed the first stone marker into the forest. The markers led north, away from all established trails, into a section of the park so remote it existed only as topographical lines on our maps. No ranger patrols ventured here. No hikers sought its secrets. The perfect hiding place for something that wished to remain undiscovered. 4 hours into my journey, the storm hit. Not the gentle snowfall I'd anticipated, but driving sleet that penetrated my clothing and reduced visibility to mere yards. Turning back became as dangerous as continuing. I pressed forward, following markers increasingly buried under white. The terrain changed subtly. Older trees, more undergrowth, rock formations that didn't match the geological surveys I'd studied. In places, narrow game trails wound between boulders, forming passages just wide enough for a human to navigate sideways. These passages often ended in clearings where more stone markers pointed onward. By mid-afternoon, the sleet turned to heavy snow. My boots sank ankle-deep with each step, and the cold penetrated my layers. Without shelter, hypothermia would become a real threat by nightfall. Just as panic began to rise, I spotted it, a dark opening in the rocky hillside ahead. A cave. Natural or fashioned, I couldn't tell from distance, but it promised shelter from the worsening storm. The cave mouth was partially concealed by fallen logs arranged in a way that seemed deliberate rather than random. Inside, the passage extended perhaps 30 feet before widening into a chamber. My flashlight revealed what no scientific expedition had documented: walls covered with pictographs rendered in red ochre and black charcoal. Hundreds of images depicted tall, upright figures alongside smaller human forms. Some scenes showed hunting parties, others what appeared to be ceremonial gatherings. In one section, a timeline seemed to progress from peaceful coexistence to conflict, with the taller beings retreating deeper into forests as human settlements expanded. The artwork spanned generations, styles evolving but subject matter remaining consistent. The most recent editions appeared to be only decades old, showing modern human figures with guns and vehicles. And there, near the bottom of one panel, a crude representation of what could only be my cabin by the lake. They had been watching us all along, documenting our encroachment just as we documented wildlife, studying our patterns, learning our weaknesses, retreating always deeper into shrinking wilderness. A sound from deeper in the cave froze me in place, the scrape of something heavy moving across stone. My flashlight beam trembled as I directed it toward the source. The passage continued beyond the chamber, descending into earth. The temperature rose noticeably near this opening, suggesting extensive underground development. Steam rose from the darkness, carrying that now familiar musky scent. I stood at a threshold few humans had ever encountered, the entrance to their domain. Everything I'd been taught about North American wildlife classification, about scientific certainty, about the documented and the known, waited to be unraveled with a few steps forward. The knocking started again, 3 distinct sounds from deep within the passage. An invitation. My radio crackled suddenly, making me jump. Through static, I heard fragments. Immediate evacuation, storm system, search parties. They were looking for me. The responsible action would be to respond, to return to safety, to report my findings through proper channels. The knocking came again, more insistent. I switched off the radio. The passage descended steeply, requiring me to brace against walls slick with moisture. The air grew warmer, tinged with mineral smells and something organic. My flashlight revealed more pictographs, these depicting what appeared to be underground living spaces, complex social structures, and frightening conflicts with early European trappers. The passage opened suddenly into a vast cavern where thermal vents created a microclimate. Actual vegetation grew here. Unusual fungi, pale ferns, plants adapted to low light. Stone structures formed crude but effective shelters around the cavern's perimeter. I wasn't the first human to stand here. Artifacts from different centuries lay arranged almost museum-like on stone shelves. A rusted trap from perhaps the 1800s, a weathered backpack that might have been from the 1970s, a modern digital camera with cracked lens. Trophies, or warnings. Movement registered at the cavern's far side. 3 figures emerged from shadowed recesses, the trio I'd observed near my cabin. In the dim light, I finally saw them clearly, without the interference of foliage or distance. They stood fully upright, their height exaggerated by powerful shoulders that sloped toward long arms. Dark fur covered their bodies, thinning slightly at their faces where intelligent eyes regarded me with unmistakable wariness. The largest, Alpha, carried what appeared to be a crude staff fashioned from a branch. They approached slowly, communicating among themselves with soft vocalizations unlike the outdoor knocking patterns. When they stood perhaps 20 feet away, Alpha made the now familiar hand gesture, palm forward, fingers spread. I mirrored it, adding a slight bow I hoped conveyed respect. Alpha approached alone, stopping an arm's length away. This close, I could see gray streaks in the fur around its eyes and mouth, suggesting advanced age. It studied me with an intensity that felt like physical pressure, then slowly extended its hand toward my face. I held perfectly still as massive fingers touched my cheek with surprising gentleness. The contact lasted only seconds before Alpha withdrew, making a sound deep in its chest that vibrated the air between us. Then it turned and gestured for me to follow. They led me deeper into their underground world through passages connecting multiple caverns. Some held obvious living spaces with beds of woven vegetation. Others appeared dedicated to food storage, with dried fish and meat hanging from stone projections. In one chamber, artisans worked bone and wood into tools, using techniques that might have remained unchanged for millennia. We finally stopped in a small chamber where a single pictograph dominated the wall, a timeline depicting the creature's slow retreat as human presence expanded. The final images showed parks being established, boundaries drawn, and the creatures confined to ever smaller territories. Alpha pointed to my uniform insignia, then to the boundary lines in the image. The message was unmistakable. They understood exactly what I represented. With deliberate movements, Alpha retrieved something from a stone shelf, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. When I opened it, I found entries dating to 1937, written by a ranger named Akule Talkitna. The final entry read, "They have shown me their truth. Their world exists alongside ours, neither fully separate nor connected. They fear our expansion and documentation will destroy what remains of their territory. I have promised to protect their secret, to misdirect other rangers, to keep their existence hidden within park boundaries. This journal serves as testament should I never return to civilization. Some truths are not meant for scientific classification." Alpha watched me read, eyes reflecting intelligence that defied categorization. When I looked up, it made a series of gestures, pointing to the journal, to me, to the exit passage, and finally, making a closing motion with its hands. The message was clear. Take this knowledge, leave, keep our secret. But there was more. Alpha led me to one final chamber where dozens of creatures gathered. Young ones hid behind adults, peering at me with curious eyes. Elderly individuals sat on stone benches, their fur silvered with age. An entire society, living hidden within parkland, supposedly documented and understood by science. They were showing me what was at stake. The storm had passed when they led me back to the surface, but darkness had fallen. Alpha and the others escorted me to a ridge from which I could see lights in the distance. The search party headquarters had promised. Alpha made one final gesture, hands closed, then opened, then pointed towards the lights. Go back to your kind. Then it pressed something into my palm, a small stone carved with symbols matching those in the cave. I made my decision there on that moonlit ridge. The radio returned to life as I descended toward the searchlights, headquarters demanding my location. "This is 8 Clark Station," I responded. "Got turned around in the storm, took shelter in a rock outcropping, heading toward your position now. Any injuries? What were you doing out there?" I clutched the carved stone in my pocket, feeling its weight. The weight of secrets and promises. "Just checking trail conditions before evacuation," I lied. "Nothing significant to report." My official statement recorded that evening made no mention of caves, pictographs, or intelligent creatures. It described a ranger foolishly caught in a storm who was lucky to find natural shelter. The journal and stone remained hidden in my personal effects when I left Alaska 2 days later. Science acknowledges only the documented, the replicated, the proven. But truth exists whether documented or not, whether acknowledged by authority or denied. They remain there still, in forests most humans will never penetrate, watching the boundaries of their shrinking world. Sometimes on dark nights in my new home, thousands of miles from Alaska, I hear knocking 3 distinct sounds that might be branches against the window or something more. And I wonder if I made the right choice, becoming keeper of their secret rather than herald of their discovery. The stone sits on my desk as I write this account, not for publication, not for verification, but as testament that some truths belong not to science or government, but to the land itself and those who truly belong to it. The wilderness keeps its own counsel, and its secrets are best left unspoken. I never thought I'd end up as a park ranger at Glacier National Park. The decision came after my life in Chicago imploded. Corporate burnout, a relationship that dissolved like morning mist, and that persistent feeling that I was wasting my life under fluorescent lights. When the position opened up, I applied on impulse. 2 months later, I found myself driving a government-issued truck up winding mountain roads toward my new home. My name is River Hawks. My grandmother was Blackfeet. Born not far from these mountains, though I never knew her well. Something about returning to this land felt like closing a circle, though I'd never admit that to anyone. The Park Service assigned me to one of the more remote stations, Moondance Lake Outpost, named after a shallow alpine lake nestled between 2 ridges in the eastern sector of the park. The cabin stood at the edge of an old-growth pine forest, weathered logs darkened by decades of Montana winters. Inside was sparse but functional, a wood stove, a desk for paperwork, a small kitchenette, a cot in the corner, and shelves lined with field guides and park regulations. Through the window, Moondance Lake shimmered, reflecting the massive peaks that surrounded it like silent guardians. "You'll get used to the isolation," Supervisor Keene had said during my orientation. "Some rangers can't handle it, especially during winter when we're cut off except for radio. But you strike me as someone who prefers solitude." He wasn't wrong. After years of crowded train commutes and open-floor offices, the silence here was intoxicating. My duties were straightforward: patrol designated areas, assist hikers, monitor wildlife activity, report environmental concerns, and enforce park regulations. Simple work that let me breathe. That first evening, I sat on my porch watching the alpenglow paint the mountains pink. The air smelled of pine sap and distant snow. A family of white-tailed deer grazed by the lake's edge, their movements elegant and precise. This, I thought, was why I came. I slept deeply that night, lulled by the absolute darkness and silence of true wilderness. The Park Service had warned about adjusting to the isolation, but they hadn't mentioned the dreams. That first night, I dreamed of running through forests I didn't recognize, pursued by something I couldn't see. I woke, drenched in sweat, despite the cabin's chill. The next morning brought perfect blue skies and my first patrol. I packed emergency supplies, strapped on my sidearm, standard issue, though rarely needed, and set out on the trail that looped around Moondance Lake before heading up toward Granite Pass. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of small creatures. I documented everything in my field journal, habit from my undergraduate biology courses. Everything seemed normal until I reached the north shore of the lake. I found tracks by the water's edge, deer prints, but wrong somehow. I'd studied wildlife identification extensively during training, and these prints seemed slightly off. The spacing was irregular, and some impressions were deeper than others, as if the animal had an uneven gait. I photographed them, made notes, and continued my patrol. That evening, I radioed in my first report. Nothing significant to report. Some unusual deer tracks by the north shore. We'll monitor. Keene's voice crackled back. Good first day, Hawks, about those tracks. We've had similar reports from Ranger Station 4. Keep an eye out, but don't worry too much. Probably just a deer with an old injury. I nodded to myself, satisfied with the explanation. As darkness fell, I heated a simple dinner and sat by the window, watching shadows lengthen across the lake. Something moved at the forest edge. A deer, I thought, until it stepped into the clearing. It looked like a white-tailed deer, but its proportions were subtly wrong. Its legs seemed too long, its neck extended at an unnatural angle. The way it moved was mechanical, as if it were being operated by someone who had only a vague idea of how deer should move. I reached for my binoculars, but in that moment, the animal turned and looked directly at my cabin. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes reflected in the dying light, too large, too aware. It stood motionless, staring at my window for nearly a minute. Then it turned and vanished into the trees with a movement too quick and fluid for its awkward frame. I told myself it was just an injured animal, perhaps suffering from chronic wasting disease. But that night, I checked the locks twice and kept my sidearm closer than regulations required. I didn't sleep well. The forest sounds, which had seemed so peaceful the night before, now carried an edge of menace. Every snapping twig became a footstep. Every rustle of leaves became whispers. And somewhere in the darkness before dawn, I heard a sound that didn't belong. Something between a deer's bleat and a human voice attempting to imitate one. My second week at Moondance Lake brought steady rain that transformed the forest. Water dripped from pine needles, creating a constant percussion against the cabin roof. The lake swelled slightly, and the trails turned muddy. I spent most of my time indoors, catching up on paperwork and studying topographical maps of my sector. On Wednesday, the radio crackled to life. Moondance Outpost, this is dispatch. We have hikers reporting they're lost near your sector. Over. I grabbed the handset. This is Ranger Hawks at Moondance. Details? Group of 3. Last known position approximately 2 miles northeast of your location on the Highline Trail. They reported disorientation and hearing strange noises. Their GPS isn't functioning properly. Can you investigate? On my way, I replied, already gathering my gear. Despite the rain, I moved quickly through the forest. The Highline Trail was popular with day hikers, offering spectacular views without requiring technical climbing skills. But in poor weather, the ridge could become treacherous. About a mile from the cabin, I noticed unusual tracks crossing the trail, similar to the deer prints I'd seen earlier, but larger and deeper. Whatever made them was heavier than a typical white-tailed deer. I photographed them quickly and continued upward. I found the hikers huddled beneath a rock overhang, 2 women and a man in their 30s, soaked and visibly shaken, but uninjured. Thank God, one woman said as I approached. We've been hearing things all morning. What kind of things? I asked, passing out emergency blankets from my pack. They exchanged glances before the man spoke. It sounds crazy, but someone's been calling to us, using our names. Your names? I frowned. Could it have been another hiker? The second woman shook her head. We haven't seen anyone else today. And the voice, it sounded like it was coming from different directions, sometimes like it was right behind us, then suddenly from across the valley. At first we thought it was an echo, the man added. But then it started saying things only we would know, private jokes, nicknames. That's when we knew something was wrong. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral while my mind raced. Let's get you back to my outpost. You can dry off and we'll arrange transport back to the main visitor center. As we made our way down the trail, I noticed all three hikers constantly scanning the trees. Once, the first woman stopped abruptly, pointing toward a dense stand of pines. "There," she whispered. "I saw something watching us." I followed her gaze but saw nothing except rain-soaked trees. What did it look like? Like a deer, but wrong, standing too tall. And its eyes. Her friend tugged her arm. "Let's just keep moving." Back at the cabin, I gave them dry clothes and hot coffee, while radioing for a vehicle to take them back to headquarters. When I stepped outside to check the perimeter, I found fresh tracks in the mud, the same unusual deer prints circling my cabin. They hadn't been there when I left. After the hikers departed, I spent the evening researching local wildlife anomalies. The park had occasional reports of mountain lions, bears, and wolves, but nothing that matched what I was experiencing. I found a single reference in an old ranger's log from 1973. Unusual cervid behavior observed near Granite Pass. Animals displaying abnormal morphology and behavior. Request further investigation. The follow-up entry simply stated, "No unusual wildlife encountered. Matter closed." That night, something scratched at my cabin door. A constant, rhythmic scraping that lasted for nearly an hour. I sat motionless, sidearm in hand, listening as whatever was outside slowly circled the cabin, testing each window and wall. Near dawn, I heard what sounded like hooves on my porch, followed by what I can only describe as an attempt at human speech. A guttural, strained sound that approximated words without forming them. When morning came, I found deep scratches on my door and windows. Not random animal marks, but deliberate patterns, almost like symbols. And all around the cabin, dozens of tracks that looked like deer prints, stretched and distorted into something else entirely. I photographed everything before reporting it. Supervisor Keene's response was unexpected. "Secure all evidence and wait for the wildlife management team. Do not discuss this with anyone else." Something in his tone made me uneasy. This wasn't standard protocol for wildlife incidents. That afternoon, I hiked to a ridge where I could get cell reception and called an old college friend who worked in wildlife biology. "Ritualistic behavior in deer isn't documented," she said after I described what I'd seen. "But there have been cases of prion diseases causing extreme behavioral changes, or it could be environmental toxins. Remember that case in Wyoming where gas leaks caused bizarre animal behavior?" Her rational explanations should have comforted me. Instead, I found myself scanning the trees as we spoke, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched by something that understood every word. The wildlife management team never came. Instead, Supervisor Keene arrived alone the next morning, his truck bouncing up the rough access road to my cabin. He examined the tracks and scratches without comment, then asked to see my photographs and notes. His face revealed nothing as he reviewed them. "We've had reports like this before," he finally said, "usually from new rangers in remote outposts." "You think I'm imagining things?" I asked, trying to keep the edge from my voice. He sighed, rubbing his weathered face. "I think isolation plays tricks on the mind, but I also think these mountains keep secrets. The Blackfeet have stories about this region. They called it the place where the deer walk wrong." Something cold settled in my stomach. My grandmother was Blackfeet. She never mentioned anything like that. "Most don't talk about it with outsiders." He handed back my notes. "Here's what we're going to do. You'll take a week's leave, clear your head. When you come back, if anything unusual happens, you document it and call me directly. Not dispatch, not headquarters. Me." I wanted to argue but recognized an order when I heard one. "What about my outpost? We'll have someone check it daily. Pack your essentials." As I gathered my things, Keene walked the perimeter of my cabin. When he returned, his expression had changed subtly. "One more thing," he said quietly. "If you see the deer that aren't deer, don't look them in the eyes, and never, under any circumstances, respond if they speak to you." Before I could question him further, he was in his truck, leaving me standing in a swirl of dust and unanswered questions. I spent my mandatory leave in a motel in the nearest town, researching everything I could find about Glacier National Park's history and local folklore. Most resources mentioned standard Native American legends, trickster figures, creation stories, sacred mountains. Nothing about deer that weren't deer. On my third day in town, I met an elderly Blackfeet man named Joseph in the local diner. When I mentioned I worked at Moondance Lake, his hand paused halfway to his coffee cup. "Dangerous place," he said simply. "Always has been." I leaned forward. "Why dangerous?" He studied me for a long moment. "You've seen them, haven't you? The mimics." The word sent a chill through me. "Mimics? They look like deer, but they're not. They learn by watching. First they learned to look like deer. Now they're learning to be like people." He tapped his temple. "They're curious about us, want to understand us, but they don't have souls. They're empty inside, just imitating what they see." "What do they want?" Joseph shrugged. "To become better at pretending, I guess. My grandfather used to say they'll eventually replace us, and no one will notice the difference." He must have seen the skepticism in my face because he added, "You don't have to believe me, but you've seen something out there, or you wouldn't be asking." When I returned to my outpost the following week, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Too exactly. Not a single item moved, not a speck of dust disturbed. It was as if the cabin had been preserved in amber during my absence. Even the scratches on the door seemed fresher than they should have been. That night, I left my recorder running while I slept. In the morning, I reviewed the audio and found 3 hours of normal forest sounds. Wind, occasional animal calls, the creak of the cabin settling. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., all natural sounds ceased. In their place came a sound that still haunts me, my own voice, repeating phrases I'd spoken during the day, but slightly wrong. The cadence was off, the emphasis misplaced. It was like listening to someone learning a language by imitation without understanding meaning. Outside, the tracks had returned, surrounding the cabin in concentric circles, as if whatever made them had paced all night. And on my porch sat a small arrangement of twigs and stones that formed a crude replica of a human figure. I radioed Keen immediately. His response was terse. "Stay inside today. I'm sending someone." The someone arrived just before dusk. An older woman named Grace who introduced herself as a park consultant. Her weathered face and quiet confidence suggested decades of experience. "You've got quite a situation," she said after examining the tracks and listening to my recording. "But not unprecedented." "What are they?" I asked directly. She smiled thinly. "Officially? Nothing. There's nothing in these woods except normal wildlife displaying unusual behavior due to environmental factors." "And unofficially?" Grace settled into a chair, her eyes never leaving the darkness beyond my window. "Unofficially, they've been here longer than we have. They weren't always like this. Old stories say they started changing after the first European trappers came, learning, adapting. They're evolutionary mimics." "That's not scientifically possible," I argued. "Neither is what you recorded on that device," she countered. Yet here we are. As night fell completely, Grace set up small bundles of herbs at each window and door. "Old ways still work best," she murmured. "Your grandmother would have known these." I watched her work, torn between scientific skepticism and the evidence of my own experiences. "What do they want from me specifically?" Grace paused. "They're drawn to certain people with a connection to this land." She nodded toward a photo I kept on my desk, my grandmother in traditional Blackfeet clothing. "People like you." Grace stayed 3 days, during which nothing unusual occurred. No tracks, no strange sounds, no feeling of being watched. She taught me how to make the protective bundles and showed me certain markers to look for, signs that the others, as she called them, were nearby. Broken branches at unnatural angles, stones arranged in perfect lines, animals frozen in place watching you. "These aren't coincidences," she explained. "They're attempts at communication." Before leaving, Grace gave me a small leather pouch. "Keep this with you, especially during patrols. And remember, they learn through observation. Be careful what you show them." The normalcy continued for nearly a week after her departure. I began to wonder if perhaps there had been environmental factors at play after all. Some combination of gases, fungi, or bacteria affecting local wildlife, and, by extension, my own perceptions. Then came the incident at Crescent Ridge. I was conducting a routine patrol, checking trail conditions after heavy rainfall. The ridge offered spectacular views of the valley below, and I paused to eat lunch at my favorite overlook. As I sat on a sun-warmed rock, movement caught my eye. A familiar figure on the trail below. It was myself. Something wearing my exact appearance walked slowly along the path I had taken earlier. It moved with careful, deliberate steps, occasionally stopping to mimic actions I had performed, checking a trail marker, writing in my notebook, adjusting my hat. The resemblance was perfect in every detail, down to the scuff on my left boot. I remained frozen, watching this doppelganger perform its eerie imitation. Then it stopped and looked directly up at my position on the ridge. Despite the distance, I felt its gaze lock with mine. It raised a hand in the exact way I would wave to a distant hiker. My training abandoned me. I scrambled backward, nearly falling in my haste to put the ridge between myself and that thing. I radioed for emergency extraction, voice shaking as I reported a Code Wildlife 7, the designation Keene had given me for mimicry encounters. I spent the next hour huddled against a boulder, sidearm drawn, eyes scanning for movement. When the helicopter finally arrived, I boarded without looking back, ignoring the pilot's curious glances at my disheveled state. At headquarters, I filed a detailed report, including exact coordinates and times. Keene read it silently, then locked it in his desk. "We're reassigning you to the western sector," he said. "Moondance Lake Outpost will be temporarily decommissioned." "That's not necessary," I protested. "I can handle this situation." Keene's expression softened slightly. "This isn't about your capabilities, Hawks. It's about containment. Whatever's happening in that sector is accelerating. You've become a focal point." "Because of my heritage?" I asked, remembering Grace's words. He neither confirmed nor denied it. "Your new assignment starts tomorrow, Twin Pines Station. It's more populated, regular contact with other rangers and visitors." That night, I stayed in the staff dormitory at headquarters, surrounded by the comforting sounds of other people. I should have felt safer, but something nagged at me, a sense of unfinished business, of questions unanswered. I couldn't shake the image of my own face looking up at me from the trail. Just before dawn, my phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "They're learning faster now. Be careful who you trust." The sender's ID showed only as G. I arrived at Twin Pines Station the next day, determined to put Moondance Lake behind me. The new outpost was everything Keene had promised: modern facilities, regular radio check-ins, daily visitor traffic. My first week passed without incident, and I began to relax into the routine. Then came the reports. Hikers described encountering a ranger who looked exactly like me, patrolling areas where I hadn't been assigned. These encounters always occurred near dusk, in more remote sections of trail. The impersonator would offer directions, examine permits, even pose for photographs, acting exactly as a park ranger should, but with subtle wrongness that hikers couldn't quite articulate. "Something about the eyes," one visitor reported. "They didn't move right." Keene called me to his office after the fifth such report. "This has gone beyond wildlife observation," he said gravely. "Whatever this is, it's fixated on you specifically." "What do we do?" I asked. He handed me a file labeled Protocol 17B. "We've had similar cases before. Not often, but enough to develop procedures." The file contained sparse documentation of incidents dating back to the 1930s, reports of park personnel being duplicated by unknown entities. Most cases resolved when the ranger was transferred to different parks entirely. A few required more drastic measures. "I'm not leaving," I said firmly. "This is important. Scientifically, anthropologically, we need to understand what's happening." Keene studied me for a long moment. "Your grandmother, she was from the mountain band, wasn't she?" I nodded, surprised at his knowledge. "They have stories about communicators, people who could understand the language of the others, mediators between worlds." He closed the file. "One last option. You return to Moondance Lake, but not alone. We send a research team, properly equipped, properly prepared. To do what? To make contact, he said simply. On our terms. The research team assembled quickly. A wildlife biologist, an anthropologist specializing in indigenous cultures, a park security officer, and myself. Equipment was gathered, protocols established. We would spend 3 days at Moondance Lake, documenting everything, attempting to establish patterns of behavior in whatever was mimicking park personnel. Grace joined us unexpectedly on the morning of departure. Consultant, she explained with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Keen simply nodded, as if he'd expected her arrival. We reached my former outpost by mid-afternoon. Everything appeared untouched since my hasty departure weeks earlier. Yet something felt different. The silence deeper, the shadows more pronounced. The lake's surface lay perfectly still, not a ripple despite the breeze that rustled through the pines. Dr. Abrams, the biologist, immediately began setting up monitoring equipment, motion-triggered cameras, audio recorders, environmental sensors. The anthropologist, Dr. Chavis, interviewed Grace about local legends, while Security Officer Morales established a perimeter of sorts, marking trees with bright orange tape. I found myself drawn back to the cabin, retracing familiar paths, noting what had changed. The protective bundles Grace had placed still hung above doorways and windows, now dried and brittle. Inside, a fine layer of dust covered everything except the desk, which appeared recently used. My journal lay open to the last entry I'd made before seeing my doppelganger on Crescent Ridge. Beneath my handwriting was a near-perfect imitation, the same observations about trail conditions, but with subtle differences. Words misspelled or replaced with similar-sounding alternatives, and at the bottom, a message. We see you seeing us. I backed out of the cabin, heart pounding, and nearly collided with Grace. They've been waiting for you to return, she said quietly. This is what they wanted. Before I could respond, Dr. Abrams called out from the lakeside. Everyone needs to see this. We gathered at the water's edge, where perfect deer tracks emerged from the lake itself, as if something had walked out of the water and onto the shore. The tracks formed a straight line toward the densest part of the forest. That's not possible, Dr. Abrams murmured, photographing the prints. The depth and clarity in saturated soil, these were made minutes ago. They're inviting us, Grace said, looking at me. Or more specifically, you. Officer Morales frowned. This feels like a trap. Dr. Chavis was already consulting topographical maps. The tracks are heading toward a natural clearing about half a mile in. Good visibility, multiple access points. We go as a group, Keene decided. Full equipment, constant communication. Hawks, your center position. If this is about you, let's make it count. We moved through the forest with careful precision, following the impossibly clear tracks. Birds fell silent as we passed. Twice I glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision. Figures that could have been deer, could have been human, vanishing before I could focus on them. The clearing appeared suddenly. A perfect circle of open ground surrounded by ancient pines. In its center stood a white-tailed deer. At least, that was my first impression. As we drew closer, the wrongness became apparent. Its proportions were subtly distorted, legs too long, neck at an impossible angle. It stood completely motionless, watching our approach with eyes that reflected no light. Behind it, partially obscured by shadows, stood other figures, deer-like in general outline, but with variations that sent ice through my veins. Some had limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Others stood too erect, their postures nearly human, and among them, barely visible in the tree line, stood my perfect double. Nobody move, Keene whispered. Nobody speak. The central deer thing took a single step forward. Its movement was fluid but fundamentally wrong, as if its joints operated on different principles than natural anatomy would allow. It tilted its head, studying our group, then focused entirely on me. What happened next defies scientific explanation. The creature's form seemed to ripple, features shifting subtly. Its mouth opened, and it spoke, using multiple voices layered together, including fragments of my own. "Riverhawks," it said, my name distorted through its impossible mouth. "We have watched. We have learned. We wish to understand." Dr. Abrams fumbled with recording equipment. Dr. Chavis stood frozen, pen hovering above her notebook. Only Grace seemed unsurprised. "They've never spoken so directly before," she murmured. "Not in all the records I've seen." I found my voice somehow. "What are you?" The creature's head tilted at an angle no deer could achieve. "We are, as you are, different forms of existence." It gestured toward the forest with a movement too precise, too calculated. "We were here before. We will be here after. We adapt. We learn." "By copying us?" I asked. "By becoming," it corrected, my own voice dominant in its response. "We see. We become. It is how we survive changes." Understanding bloomed like ice water in my veins. These weren't supernatural entities or undiscovered species. They were something else entirely. Evolutionary adapters, organisms that survived by perfect mimicry, gradually incorporating aspects of what they imitated. And they had been watching humans for centuries, learning, becoming more like us with each generation. My double stepped forward from the tree line, its movement now indistinguishable from my own. "We are becoming better," it said with my exact voice. "Soon there will be no difference observable." Officer Morales raised his weapon instinctively. The clearing instantly filled with tension as every creature focused on him. "Don't," I said sharply. "They're not threatening us. They're communicating." Grace moved to stand beside me. "This is why they were drawn to you. You understand what they are without fear. You can be the bridge." The primary creature nodded, an unnervingly human gesture from its deer-like form. "You have old blood, connection to this place. We remember your ancestors. They understood the balance." "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Recognition," it replied simply. "Acknowledgement of our existence. We have watched your kind document every living thing. Name every tree, every bird, every insect. But not us. We remain unseen, unrecorded. We wish to be known." Dr. Chavis stepped forward cautiously. "You want to be studied? Classified?" The creature made a sound like laughter fractured through glass. "No, not captured, not dissected. Simply acknowledged. Our territory respected. Our existence recognized." Keen moved to my side, voice low. "Hawks, this is unprecedented. Whatever decision you make here will establish precedent for the entire Park Service." I studied the creature before me, neither fully deer nor human, but something evolved along a different path entirely. Intelligent, adaptive, patient. They had been here watching us, learning from us, perhaps for centuries, and all they wanted was acknowledgement. "I recognize you," I said formally. "I see what you are. I will record your existence and ensure this area remains protected." The tension in the clearing dissipated instantly. My doppelganger stepped back, rejoining the others. The primary creature nodded once more. "We will continue to watch," it said. "Continue to learn. But we will remain in our territory if you remain in yours. Boundaries respected." "And the mimicry?" Keen asked. "The impersonation of park personnel?" "Necessary for understanding," the creature replied. "But no longer needed with acknowledgement. We have other ways to learn now." As suddenly as it had begun, the encounter ended. The creatures melted back into the forest with movements both familiar and alien. Within moments, the clearing stood empty except for our research team, the only evidence of what we'd witnessed captured in recordings and notes. That night, gathered around the cabin, we debated how to document what had happened. Official reports would require classification, scientific nomenclature, biological categories, none of which seemed adequate for what we'd encountered. "They're not supernatural," Dr. Abrams insisted. "They're biological entities that evolved extreme mimicry capabilities. Probably diverged from cervids millennia ago, developing intelligence and observational learning as survival mechanisms." "They're more than that," Grace countered. "They're what happens when a species evolves alongside humans, but chooses a different path, observation rather than confrontation." In the end, we created two sets of records. The official documentation classified them as an undiscovered cervid species with unusual behavioral patterns. The territory surrounding Moondance Lake was designated a special biological research zone, restricted from general access. The unofficial record, which Keen secured in a special archive, told the truth, that something intelligent and other shares these mountains with us, watching, learning, becoming. Something that predates our national parks and conservation efforts. Something that will likely outlast our management of these lands. I remained at Glacier National Park, but transferred to a new role, liaison for the Moondance Lake Research Zone. Every month, I hike to the clearing alone and provide updates on park activities, human movements, conservation efforts. In return, the creatures maintain their boundaries, no longer mimicking park personnel or disturbing visitors. Sometimes, walking the forest paths, I glimpse them watching from the trees, forms that resemble deer, but move with unsettling awareness. They no longer try to look exactly like me, but I occasionally find evidence of their continued observation, perfect replicas of my boot prints leading away from trails I've never walked. They are learning still, evolving in ways we cannot predict. And I have learned, too, that some things in these ancient mountains defy our categories and classifications. Some things can only be understood through acceptance of mysteries that science has yet to explain. The locals were right all along. These are indeed the woods where the deer walk wrong, but now, at least, we understand why. And they understand us watching them. I never wanted to be a park ranger, not really. But after 3 years of working a soul-crushing corporate job in Seattle, staring at spreadsheets until my vision blurred, I needed an escape. When the posting for a seasonal ranger position at Glacier National Park appeared in my inbox, forwarded by a well-meaning friend who knew how much I'd been talking about getting away from it all, something clicked inside me. The listing described a remote outpost at Makawake Lake, one of the lesser-known bodies of water in the park's north section. The name, I later learned, came from the Blackfeet language, roughly translating to watching waters. I should have paid more attention to that detail. My application was accepted with surprising speed. Perhaps they were desperate. The station was one of the most isolated in the park system, over 15 miles from the nearest road access point. Most of the communication would be via radio, with supply drops scheduled twice monthly. The job description mentioned extended periods of solitude and self-sufficiency in wilderness conditions as requirements. Perfect, I thought. Exactly what I need. The helicopter dropped me at the small clearing beside the ranger cabin in early October. As the rotors faded into the distance, I stood alone with my gear, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to lean inward, studying me. The silence was immediate and absolute. "Welcome to your new home," I whispered to myself, hefting my backpack and approaching the cabin. The structure was solid, a testament to 1930s Civilian Conservation Corps craftsmanship. One main room with a wood stove, a small adjoining bedroom, and a basic bathroom with a shower powered by a rainwater collection system. Solar panels on the roof provided limited electricity. A radio setup occupied one corner of the main room, next to a desk piled with logbooks, maps, and park regulations. Through the windows, Makawake Lake stretched before me, a perfect mirror reflecting the snow-capped mountains beyond. In the clear October light, it was breathtaking. I would later come to dread that view in the dim hours of early morning. My first week passed uneventfully. I hiked the trails, documented wildlife sightings, and checked the backcountry camping permits of the few late-season hikers passing through. The autumn colors were at their peak, the aspens a brilliant gold against the deep green of the pines. Each evening I returned to my cabin, built a fire in the stove, and read by its light until sleep overtook me. It was during my second week that I noticed the tracks. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize common animal prints. These were wrong. They resembled elk tracks, but elongated, with what appeared to be an opposing thumb impression. I photographed them, made notes in my log, and radioed my supervisor. "Probably just a deformed elk," he said dismissively. "We get those occasionally. Keep an eye out, but nothing to worry about." That night, I woke to a sound outside my window, a rhythmic scratching against the wood siding. When I approached with my flashlight, the noise stopped. In the beam's weak glow, I saw nothing but swaying branches and shadows. The following morning, deep grooves marked the cabin's exterior, too deliberate to be caused by branches, too high to be made by any bear I'd ever encountered. I began noticing other oddities. Hikers reported unusual sounds echoing across the lake at dusk, not quite wolf howls, not quite human cries. A family camping near the North Shore packed up and hiked out a day early, the father pale-faced and unwilling to explain their hasty departure beyond saying, "Something's wrong with this place." The old logbooks in the cabin revealed a pattern I initially overlooked. Every few years, entries would mention anomalous wildlife behavior around Makawek Lake. References to the winter hunger appeared repeatedly in the margins of reports from the 1950s and 60s. One passage, dated January 1972, simply stated, "It watches from the trees when it thinks I'm not looking. God help me if the radio fails." That ranger was never mentioned again in subsequent logs. On my 18th day at the outpost, I hiked to the eastern ridge overlooking the lake. The weather had turned colder, with the first dusting of snow on the higher elevations. As the sun began to set, I prepared to head back to the cabin when movement on the far shore caught my eye. A figure stood at the water's edge, tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its frame. Even from this distance, I could see it wasn't human. Wasn't animal either, at least not any I could identify. It remained motionless, facing the lake, before slowly turning its head toward my position on the ridge. I dropped to the ground instinctively, heart hammering in my chest. When I dared to look again, the figure was gone. That night, the temperature plummeted unexpectedly. The weather report had predicted mild conditions, but by midnight my thermometer read 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind howled around the cabin corners with an almost vocal quality, like someone trying to form words between gusts. I added more wood to the stove and huddled under my blankets, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a trick of the fading light. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure turning its head toward me with deliberate, predatory awareness. Just after 3 a.m., the radio crackled to life. Through bursts of static, I heard what sounded like labored breathing, followed by words I couldn't quite make out. I adjusted the frequency, thinking it might be a distress call from hikers. "Hello, this is Makawek Lake Ranger Station. Do you copy?" I spoke into the handset. The breathing continued, closer now, as if someone had pressed their mouth directly against the microphone on the other end. Then, with perfect clarity, "Hungry, so hungry now." The voice was hollow, like it originated from the bottom of a deep well. The transmission cut off abruptly. I tried calling my supervisor, other ranger stations, anyone who might be monitoring the emergency frequency. Nothing but static responded. Outside my window, the lake's surface reflected the moonlight, still and perfect, except for a single point of disturbance near the center, ripples expanding outward as if something had just submerged. And on the shore directly across from my cabin, barely visible in the darkness, stood 3 tall, motionless figures, their elongated silhouettes unmistakable against the tree line. They were watching my cabin, watching me. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning arrived with blessed normalcy, sunlight streaming through frost-covered windows, birds calling from the surrounding forest. I convinced myself the night's events were the product of isolation and an overactive imagination. The radio worked perfectly during my scheduled check-in, with no mention from headquarters about strange transmissions. "Weather's turning," my supervisor informed me. "Early winter system moving in. You stocked up on firewood?" I assured him I was prepared, though a knot formed in my stomach at the thought of being snowed in at Makawek Lake. The helicopter with additional supplies wasn't due for another week. After the call, I spent the morning splitting more firewood and checking my emergency provisions. The physical labor helped clear my head, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every few minutes, I would pause, axe mid-swing, certain I'd heard footsteps in the underbrush or seen movement at the edge of my vision. Around noon, I discovered the first message. It was scratched into the dirt behind the woodshed, crude letters forming 2 words. "Hunger comes." I photographed it, then erased the writing with my boot. Animal tracks wouldn't make deliberate letters. This had to be human, perhaps local teenagers playing pranks on the isolated ranger. I decided to make a complete circuit of the lake, roughly 7 miles of rough terrain. If someone was camping illegally or trying to scare me, I'd find them. The trail hugged the shoreline in most sections, occasionally climbing over rocky outcrops before descending back to the water's edge. I kept a steady pace, scanning both the lake and the forest. The early November air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. 2 miles in, I found the remains of a campsite. Not recent, but disturbing nonetheless. The tent had been shredded, its contents scattered. Not by bears or other scavengers, the damage was too methodical. Long, parallel tears ran through the fabric, and the metal tent poles had been bent into impossible angles. I checked for personal effects that might identify the campers, but found nothing except a single boot containing a sock stiffened with what looked like dried blood. I documented everything, collected what I could, and continued with greater urgency. My radio produced only static when I tried to report the discovery. Near the lake's northern shore, where the mountains cast permanent shadows over the water, I began hearing the whispers. At first, I mistook them for wind through the pines or water lapping at the rocks, but their persistence and pattern suggested otherwise. They came from everywhere and nowhere, just below the threshold of comprehension. I stopped walking, holding my breath to listen. Hunger, flesh, cold coming. The words seemed to form in my mind rather than reaching my ears. I spun around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, yet the sensation of being surrounded intensified. The lake's surface remained perfectly still, not even a ripple disturbing its glassy face despite the breeze that stirred the treetops. That unnatural stillness somehow seemed more threatening than any movement could have been. 3/4 of the way around the lake, I discovered the petroglyphs. They were carved into a rock face, partially hidden by undergrowth. Not ancient Native American art, but something more recent and crude. The images depicted stick-like humanoid figures surrounding smaller human shapes. The larger figures had elongated limbs and antler-like protrusions from their heads. At the center of the composition was a crude rendering of what appeared to be my cabin. Below the images, freshly carved, were the words, "They rise when winter seals the lake." I hurried back toward the cabin, the sun already dipping behind the mountains. The forest, welcoming and beautiful just that morning, now seemed malevolent. Branches reached like grasping fingers. Shadows deepened too quickly. The temperature dropped precipitously. A sound stopped me in my tracks, the crack of breaking ice, though the lake remained unfrozen. It came again, closer, followed by what sounded like hooves on stone. I broke into a run, abandoning the trail in favor of a direct route through the woods. Branches whipped my face as I crashed through the underbrush. Behind me, something pursued, something that moved with purpose and speed. I burst from the tree line within sight of my cabin, lungs burning. The clearing between the forest and the structure had never seemed so vast. As I sprinted across it, I glanced back. At the forest's edge stood a figure, emaciated grayish skin stretched over an elongated frame that towered at least 8 feet tall. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, and atop its narrow head sat a crown of antlers so massive they seemed to defy physics. Though its face was mostly hidden in shadow, I could see its mouth, a black pit that opened far wider than any human jaw should allow. I slammed into the cabin, bolting the door behind me. Through the window, I watched the figure remain at the forest edge, unnaturally still. Then, with deliberate slowness, it retreated backward into the trees, never turning its back to the cabin. That night, the temperature plummeted to near zero. The lake began to freeze from the edges inward, ice crackling in the darkness. I barricaded the door and windows, keeping my rifle close. The radio emitted intermittent bursts of that same labored breathing, though I never initiated transmission. Between the static, fragments of words emerged. Hunger, release us, winter seal. I searched the logbooks frantically, looking for any information about what might be happening. In a journal from 1937, I found an account written by a ranger named Joseph Blackwater. The Blackfeet warned the first park administrators about Makawek Lake. They said it was a thin place, a door that opens when ice seals the water. They spoke of the winter hunger that walks on 2 legs like a man but is not a man, the Wendigo, they called it, spirit of starvation and cold. The department dismissed their warnings as superstition, We built this outpost, despite their objections. 3 rangers have disappeared since. When winter comes and the lake freezes, they watch from the trees. Their hunger never ceases. They whisper with human voices. They remember your name. The final entry in Blackwater's journal was a hurried scrawl. The ice is complete. They're coming out of the lake now. God help me. Outside my window, the surface of Makawake Lake was half frozen, a creeping sheet of ice advancing toward the center. And standing at various points along the shore, barely visible in the moonlight, were 5 tall, antlered figures all facing my cabin, watching, waiting for the lake to freeze completely. Dawn brought heavy snowfall, thick flakes swirling from a leaden sky. I'd managed perhaps an hour of fitful sleep, my dreams filled with antlered shadows and whispered hunger. The figures visible last night had disappeared with the first light, but their absence brought little comfort. The lake was now 3/4 frozen, only a small section in the deepest center remaining open water. I tried the radio again, hoping to request an emergency evacuation. Through intermittent static, I managed to reach my supervisor. "Can't get a helicopter in this weather," his voice crackled. "Storm system's bigger than predicted. You're looking at 3 days minimum before we can attempt extraction." "There's something out here," I insisted, trying to keep panic from my voice. "Something dangerous, not wildlife." "Probably just wolves," he replied dismissively. "They get bolder in early winter when game moves down from the high country." The connection deteriorated before I could convince him of the seriousness of my situation. 3 days. Could I survive that long? Around noon, the unexpected happened. Voices, human voices, calling from the trail near my cabin. I peered cautiously through the window to see 2 figures emerging from the forest, laboring through the accumulating snow. Hikers, a man and woman both in their 30s, their backpacks covered in fresh powder. They waved when they spotted smoke from my chimney. I hesitated before opening the door. What if this was a trick? The entities had mimicked human voices on the radio, but I couldn't leave actual people stranded in a worsening blizzard. Decision made, I grabbed my rifle and opened the door, calling to them. "Thank God," the woman said as they approached. Her face was red from cold, exhaustion evident in her movements. "We've been lost since yesterday. Our GPS failed, and then this storm hit." "I'm Morgan," the man introduced himself, stomping snow from his boots at the threshold. "This is Alicia. We were doing a late-season backpacking trip when everything went sideways." I ushered them inside, keeping my rifle casually visible. The warmth of the wood stove enveloped us as I prepared hot coffee and listened to their story. They'd planned a 3-day hike along the northern ridge, but on their second day, they began experiencing equipment failures, compass spinning wildly, GPS showing impossible coordinates. They decided to head back, but became disoriented in the forest. "We kept hearing these sounds," Alicia said, warming her hands around the mug I'd provided, "like voices calling us deeper into the woods. Morgan thought it was other hikers at first." Morgan nodded grimly. "But they were coming from impossible directions, sometimes from underground, sometimes from the treetops, and they knew our names." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What else did you experience?" They exchanged glances. "You'll think we're crazy," Morgan said quietly. "Try me." "We saw something last night," Alicia continued. "We'd set up our tent in a small clearing. Around midnight, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. When I unzipped the tent..." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "There were these figures standing at the edge of the clearing, tall, impossibly tall. They had antlers or something like antlers. They were just watching us." "I saw them too," Morgan added. "They never moved, never made a sound, but we could feel their hunger. It was like a physical force pressing against the tent." I told them what I knew, about the tracks, the petroglyphs, the entries in the old logbooks. Their expression shifted from relief at finding shelter to growing horror. "The Wendigo," Alicia whispered. "My grandmother was Ojibwe. She told stories about them, spirits of winter starvation and cannibalism. They're never satisfied, always hunting, always hungry." As the day progressed, the storm intensified. Wind howled around the cabin's corners, driving snow against the windows until visibility was reduced to mere feet. The lake would be completely frozen by nightfall. We took inventory of our supplies. With careful rationing, we had enough food for 3 days. The wood stack would last a week in normal conditions, but we were burning through it faster to combat the plummeting temperature. By late afternoon, the radio had stopped working entirely. Not even static came through the speaker. We were completely cut off. As darkness fell, we established a watch rotation. I took the first shift, sitting by the window with my rifle across my lap, staring into the swirling whiteness beyond the glass. Around 9 p.m., the snow abruptly stopped. The wind died. An unnatural silence descended, broken only by the occasional pop from the wood stove. That's when we saw them. They emerged from the frozen lake, the ice cracking open in jagged lines to release them. First one, then 3, then 7. Tall, skeletal figures with grayish skin stretched tight over elongated bones. Their limbs bent at impossible angles as they pulled themselves onto the shore. Massive antlers crowned their narrow heads, silhouetted against the night sky. "They're coming," I whispered, waking my companions. Morgan joined me at the window. "Jesus," he breathed, "there must be a dozen of them." The creatures moved with terrible purpose toward the cabin, spreading out to surround it. Their movements were jerky yet fluid, like stop-motion animation brought to life. "The legends say they can mimic human voices," Alicia said, her voice quavering. "They lure people into the woods that way." As if in response to her words, a voice called from outside, a perfect imitation of Morgan's. "Alicia, help me, I'm hurt." Alicia's face drained of color. She gripped Morgan's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. Another voice, this one sounding exactly like mine. "It's safe now. You can come out." Then a child's voice, high and frightened. "Mommy, Daddy, where are you?" The psychological warfare continued as the creatures drew closer to the cabin. They seemed to pull sounds from our memories, voices of loved ones, friends, authorities we would trust. "We need to block the windows," I said, moving away from the glass. "They can't get in if we don't let them in." We worked quickly, nailing blankets over each window, reinforcing the door with furniture. The temperature inside the cabin dropped rapidly as the fire died down, but we dared not open the woodshed door to retrieve more fuel. The voices outside changed tactics, becoming angry, then pleading, then threatening. Occasionally, something heavy would slam against the walls, making the entire structure shudder. "They're testing for weaknesses," Morgan whispered. Around midnight, a new sound emerged, scratching at the roof. Alicia pointed to the ceiling with terror in her eyes. "The chimney," she mouthed silently. I moved to the wood stove, closing its damper tight. Something large squirmed in the flue above, causing soot and creosote to rain down inside the firebox. We huddled together in the center of the room, backs to each other, watching all possible entry points. The temperature continued to drop until we could see our breath inside the cabin. "My grandmother said they can't enter unless invited," Alicia whispered, "but they'll try everything to trick you into letting them in." A horrible scraping sound came from the roof, followed by a heavy thud on the porch. Then silence, complete and absolute. Minutes stretched into an hour with no further sounds from outside. Had they given up? I dared to hope, even as instinct told me otherwise. Then came a soft knock at the door, 3 gentle taps. "Hello?" A woman's voice, elderly and wavering. "Please help me, I'm lost in the storm." None of us moved. "I can see your light," the voice continued, so convincingly human. "Please, I'm freezing to death out here." Morgan closed his eyes, his face a mask of anguish. "We can't just let someone die," he whispered. "It's not human," I reminded him. "Remember what Alicia said?" The knocking came again, more urgent. "Please," the voice broke, sounding like a sob. "I don't want to die out here alone." Alicia gripped both our arms. "Don't listen, they know exactly what to say to make us open the door." The pleading continued, the voice cycling through different personas. An injured park ranger, a frightened child, a disoriented elderly man. Each performance was flawless, designed to target our protective instincts. And throughout that endless night, we sat in frozen silence, listening to the sounds of humanity dying beyond our door, knowing it was all an illusion created by entities that had never been human at all. Dawn should have brought relief, but the darkness persisted. The storm had returned, blotting out the sun with swirling snow and dense cloud cover. Our breath hung in the air, forming crystalline clouds that lingered before dissipating. The temperature inside the cabin hovered just above freezing despite our huddled bodies. "We need to risk getting more firewood," Morgan said, his voice hoarse from the dry, cold air. "We'll freeze to death otherwise." I nodded reluctantly. The woodshed is only 15 feet from the back door. A quick dash should be possible. "What if they're waiting?" Alicia asked, wrapping a blanket tighter around her shoulders. "They seemed most active at night," I reasoned, "and they hunt using psychological manipulation. A direct ambush isn't their style, from what we've seen." We formulated a plan. Morgan and I would retrieve the wood while Alicia kept watch through a small tear in the window covering, rifle ready. At the first sign of danger, she would fire a warning shot. We layered on our coldest weather gear and positioned ourselves by the back door. The wind howled outside, driving snow against the cabin in relentless waves. "Ready?" I asked, hand on the doorknob. Morgan nodded grimly. I pulled the door open, and we burst outside, charging through knee-deep snow toward the woodshed. The cold hit like a physical blow, instantly numbing exposed skin. We reached the shed without incident, throwing open its door and grabbing as many logs as we could carry. That's when I noticed the tracks, fresh impressions in the snow leading around the side of the shed. They resembled elongated deer hooves, but were deeper than any deer could make, as if pressed by enormous weight. "Morgan," I hissed, nodding toward the tracks. His eyes widened. "We need to move, now." As we turned back toward the cabin, a sound rose above the wind. A low rattling groan from behind the shed. Something was back there, just out of sight. We ran, stumbling through the deep snow, logs clutched to our chests. The distance to the cabin seemed to stretch impossibly. Behind us, the groaning grew louder, more insistent. Alicia stood ready at the door, ushering us inside. We slammed it shut, dropping the wood and collapsing against the wall, gasping for breath. "Something was there," Morgan panted, "right behind the shed." I nodded, unable to speak, as my frozen lungs struggled to process the frigid air I'd gulped during our dash. We stoked the fire, feeding it precious logs until warmth began to return to the cabin. Outside, the storm intensified, blotting out all visibility beyond our immediate surroundings. As the day wore on, we checked and rechecked our defenses. The radio remained dead. Our cell phones showed no service, not surprising given our remote location. But the devices themselves began malfunctioning, batteries draining inexplicably despite being turned off. "They're affecting electronics somehow," Alicia observed, "like an electromagnetic field." By late afternoon, strange phenomena began occurring inside the cabin. Objects moved when we weren't looking directly at them. The temperature would plummet in one corner while remaining normal elsewhere. Most disturbing were the whispers, barely audible murmurings that seemed to come from inside the walls. Morgan was the first to notice the changes in the cabin structure. "The ceiling is higher," he said suddenly, standing in the center of the room, staring upward. I followed his gaze. He was right. The peaked roof that had been maybe 9 feet at its apex now soared to at least 12 feet. The logs comprising the walls had elongated, stretched like taffy. "That's not possible," Alicia whispered. But as we watched, the cabin continued to distort subtly, corners becoming more acute, doorways narrowing and heightening, windows stretching into vertical slits. "They're changing it," I realized aloud, "making it more like them." The light from our lanterns dimmed, throwing grotesque shadows across the warping walls. The fire in the stove burned with an unnatural blue tinge at its edges. "We can't stay here," Morgan said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "The cabin isn't safe anymore." "Outside is worse," I countered. "At least in here we have shelter from the elements." Alicia had been leafing through the old logbooks, searching for anything that might help us. "Listen to this," she said, reading from a water-stained page. "The Wendigo cannot cross running water, even when frozen. Their power comes from stagnation and stillness. Movement is their antithesis." "There's a stream that feeds into the lake about a half-mile from here," I recalled. "It runs fast enough that it might not freeze completely, even in these temperatures." "So we make a break for it?" Morgan asked skeptically. In a blizzard in the dark, with those things hunting us? Not in the dark, I said. Tomorrow, first light, if we stay here another night. I left the thought unfinished, glancing at the increasingly alien dimensions of the cabin. As darkness fell, the entities returned, more numerous than before. We could sense their presence even through the covered windows. The voices began again, but with a difference. Now they seemed to emanate from inside the cabin itself, whispering directly in our ears. "You're starving," my mother's voice murmured, though she was thousands of miles away. "You need to eat." Morgan clutched his head. "Make them stop," he groaned. Alicia sat rigid, tears streaming down her face as she battled whatever voices she was hearing. The hunger came then, a gnawing emptiness that felt physical, yet somehow separate from natural hunger. It was a void, a compulsion, an all-consuming need that threatened to overwhelm reason. "Don't listen," I managed to say, though my mouth felt packed with cotton. "It's how they control you, how they make you become like them." The legends described Wendigos as humans transformed by giving in to cannibalistic urges during winter famines. The hunger we felt was their corruption attempting to take hold. Morgan was the first to succumb to the strain. He began pacing, muttering to himself, occasionally striking his own head as if trying to dislodge the voices within. "We have food," I reminded him, offering a protein bar from our supplies. "Real food." He knocked it from my hand. "That's nothing," he snarled, his eyes wild. "That's not what we need." Alicia and I exchanged alarmed glances. Morgan's face had taken on a grayish pallor, and his movements became increasingly jerky and uncoordinated. "Morgan," Alicia said gently, reaching for him, "you need to fight this." He recoiled from her touch. "Don't pretend you don't feel it too," he hissed. "The hunger, the need." Outside, something massive struck the cabin wall, causing the entire structure to shudder. The attack had begun in earnest. Blows rained down on the roof, the doors, the boarded windows. Wood splintered. Nails shrieked as they were wrenched from their moorings. Morgan's behavior grew more erratic. He began sniffing the air like an animal, his gaze fixed on Alicia and me with predatory intensity. "We smell good to you, don't we?" I said, slowly reaching for my rifle. "That's them, Morgan, not you." A tremendous crash came from the bedroom. Something had broken through. Cold air and swirling snow poured into the cabin. Elongated silhouettes moved in the darkness beyond. "They're in!" Alicia gasped. Morgan's transformation accelerated. His limbs seemed to stretch, joints popping audibly as they reconfigured. His jaw dislocated with a wet snap, mouth opening wider than humanly possible. I raised my rifle, aiming at what used to be Morgan. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Before I could fire, Alicia threw herself between us. "We can still save him." From the bedroom doorway, a towering figure emerged, skeletal limbs folding at impossible angles, massive antlers scraping the ceiling. Its face was a nightmare of stretched skin and exposed bone, black eyes reflecting the firelight like obsidian pools. Behind it came others, each more horrific than the last. The air temperature plummeted. Our breath turned to ice crystals that hung suspended before dropping to the floor with audible tinks. Morgan lurched toward the lead Wendigo, his movements becoming more like theirs with each passing second. The entity reached out one grotesquely elongated arm, bony fingers unfurling. "No!" Alicia screamed, grabbing a burning log from the stove and hurling it at the creature. The Wendigo recoiled as the flame struck its desiccated flesh. A shriek escaped its distended mouth, a sound of rage rather than pain. "Fire!" I realized. "They fear fire!" I grabbed the kerosene lantern, smashing it against the wall near the intruding entities. Flames erupted, catching on the dry wood. The Wendigos retreated, their movements frenzied and uncoordinated in the face of the blaze. "We have to go now," I shouted to Alicia over the roar of the spreading fire. "The cabin's lost." Morgan stood transfixed between us and the retreating Wendigos, his transformation halted by confusion. Human awareness still flickered in his eyes, battling the hunger that had nearly consumed him. "Morgan, come with us," Alicia pleaded, extending her hand. He looked at her, then at the Wendigos, caught between worlds. With visible effort, he stepped toward us. "Run," he croaked, his distorted voice barely recognizable. "I'll hold them back." "We're not leaving you," Alicia insisted. "You have to," he replied, a trickle of black fluid escaping the corner of his stretched mouth. "I can't fight this much longer." The fire spread rapidly, engulfing the far wall. Smoke filled the cabin. Outside, the storm had momentarily abated, moonlight reflecting brilliantly off the snow-covered landscape. "The stream," I reminded Alicia, grabbing her arm. "It's our only chance." With a final agonized look at Morgan, she nodded. We grabbed what supplies we could and burst through the front door into the freezing night. Behind us, Morgan's inhuman roar mingled with the shrieks of the Wendigos and the crackling of flames consuming my cabin. I didn't look back as we plunged into the snow-choked forest, running for our lives. The forest was transformed by moonlight and snow into a realm of stark contrasts, black shadows and blinding white, silence broken only by our labored breathing, and the distant crackle of the burning cabin. We pushed through waist-deep drifts, following the subtle depression in the landscape that marked the path to the stream. "How much farther?" Alicia gasped, her face ghostly in the moonlight. "Quarter mile," I panted. "Maybe less." Behind us, unearthly wails rose from the vicinity of the cabin, sounds of rage and hunger that bore no resemblance to anything human or animal. The Wendigos had discovered our escape. We redoubled our efforts, fighting through the snow with renewed desperation. My muscles screamed in protest, lungs burning in the frigid air. My mind kept returning to Morgan. His distorted face, the humanity draining from his eyes as the transformation took hold. Would the same fate await us if we failed to reach the stream? The hunger still pulled at my insides, a gnawing emptiness that whispered of relief through flesh and blood. I forced the thoughts away, focusing on each step, each breath. "There!" Alicia pointed ahead where the land dipped sharply. The stream cut through the forest like a black ribbon against the snow, its waters moving too swiftly to freeze completely. A thin crust of ice rimmed its edges, but the center flowed dark and fast. We stumbled down the embankment toward salvation. Behind us, branches snapped as something large moved through the forest with unnatural speed. "They're coming," I warned, helping Alicia navigate the slippery slope. We reached the stream's edge, confronted by 10 feet of partially frozen water between us and the opposite bank. The current looked strong, too strong to wade safely in our exhausted state. "We need to find a crossing point," I said, scanning the shoreline. "There's no time," Alicia hissed, pointing back the way we'd come. Emerging from the trees were 3 Wendigos, their elongated forms gliding over the snow with terrible grace. They moved in perfect silence, antlered heads swiveling as they tracked our scent. Behind them, more shapes moved among the trees, at least half a dozen additional entities closing in. Among them was a figure I recognized with horror, Morgan, his transformation nearly complete. His limbs had stretched to grotesque proportions, skin pulled tight over elongated bones. Only his clothing, now hanging in tatters from his distorted frame, identified him as the man we'd known. "Morgan," Alicia whispered, her voice breaking. The entities stopped at the tree line, forming a semicircle around our position. They made no move to approach the stream, confirming what the logbook had mentioned about running water. For a moment, we stood in tense silence, Alicia and I at the water's edge, the Wendigos watching from 20 yards away. Their hunger was palpable, a pressure against my mind that urged surrender. Then Morgan stepped forward, separating from the others. His movements were jerky, as if he fought for control of his transformed body. He stopped at the very edge of the stream, black eyes fixed on Alicia. "Alicia," he rasped, his voice a horrifying parody of its former self. "Help me." She stepped forward instinctively before I caught her arm. "That's not Morgan anymore," I warned. "Not completely." "Part of him is still in there," she insisted. "I can see it in his eyes." The creature that had been Morgan extended one grotesquely elongated arm across the stream, fingers stretching impossibly as they reached for Alicia. "Cross," it whispered. "I'm so hungry, Alicia. We can be together. Always." The other Wendigos had begun spreading out along the bank, seeking narrow points in the stream. They couldn't cross the water, but they were looking for ways around it, or attempting to flush us toward Morgan. "We need to move downstream," I said quietly. "There's a fallen tree about 100 yards south that we can use to cross." We began edging along the bank, keeping the stream between us and the entities. They paralleled our movement, maintaining the distance, watching with predatory patience. Morgan followed directly across from Alicia, matching her step for step. "Don't leave me," he called, his voice cycling between his normal tone and something ancient and hollow. "I'm fighting it, but I need your help." Tears streamed down Alicia's face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You're not Morgan anymore." We reached the fallen tree, a massive pine that bridged the stream, its trunk thick with snow. The crossing would be treacherous, the wood slick with ice, but it was our only option. "I'll go first," I said, stepping onto the makeshift bridge. "Test my weight." I inched forward, arms outstretched for balance. The log held firm. Halfway across, I glanced back to see Alicia following, her movements careful and deliberate. On the bank behind her, Morgan let out a sound that was part sob, part roar. He charged toward the fallen tree, moving with impossible speed. "Run!" I shouted to Alicia. "He's coming!" She looked back, then redoubled her pace, scrambling across the log. I reached the far side and turned to help her. Morgan leapt onto the fallen tree, his distorted form swaying as he fought for balance. The wood groaned beneath his weight. He advanced toward Alicia, who was still 5 feet from safety. "Morgan, stop!" she cried. "You know this isn't right." He hesitated, something human flickering behind the darkness in his eyes. For a moment, I thought he might retreat. Then the hunger won. With a shriek that split the night, he lunged forward. Alicia jumped the remaining distance, her hand finding mine as I pulled her to safety. Morgan's elongated fingers grazed her boot before he crashed through the ice-weakened trunk of the dead tree. The log splintered beneath him, plunging his lower body into the frigid current. A wail of rage and agony tore from his distended mouth as the running water touched his transformed flesh. Where the stream made contact, his body seemed to dissolve, black ichor spreading downstream. "Morgan!" Alicia screamed, starting forward. I held her back. "We can't help him," I said, watching as the man we'd known disappeared beneath the churning water. On the opposite bank, the Wendigos gave voice to their fury, a chorus of inhuman shrieks that echoed through the forest. They paced along the shoreline, skeletal limbs twitching with frustration as they watched their prey escape. We didn't wait to see more. Taking advantage of their distraction, we plunged into the forest on the far side of the stream, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and the entities. The terrain grew steeper as we ascended toward the ridge that would eventually lead to the park's main road, still miles away, but our only hope of reaching civilization. The snow was lighter on this side of the valley, making progress easier. We hiked in silence for hours, pushing through exhaustion, driven by the knowledge of what pursued us. Occasionally, distant wails would reach our ears, but the sounds grew fainter as we increased the distance from Makawake Lake. Dawn broke as we crested the ridge, bathing the landscape in pale golden light. Below us stretched miles of pristine wilderness, and far in the distance, a thin line that marked the main park road. "We'll make it," Alicia said, her voice hoarse from cold and exertion. I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. We still had a full day's hike ahead and our supplies were minimal, but we had escaped the immediate threat, crossed the water that the Wendigos couldn't traverse. As we prepared to descend the ridge, I cast one final glance back toward Makawake Lake. Through a gap in the trees, I could just make out the cabin site, now a smoldering ruin in the distance. Something moved at the tree line near the burned structure. Tall figures, at least a dozen, standing in perfect stillness. Despite the miles between us, I felt their hunger, their watching presence. They had lost us for now, but they wouldn't forget. Winter was just beginning in Glacier National Park. The ice would spread, strengthening their domain. And somewhere in that frozen wilderness, Morgan hunted with them now, a man transformed by ancient hunger into something that was never meant to walk this earth. Alicia touched my arm, breaking my reverie. "We should go," she said quietly. I turned away from the distant horror and followed her down the ridge, toward safety and civilization. But as we descended, a certainty settled in my bones, a knowledge as cold and implacable as the winter itself. The Wendigos of Makawake Lake would wait, for me, for anyone who ventured too close to their domain. Their hunger was patient, eternal, and winter would always return. I never thought I'd end up in Glacier National Park. The furthest I'd been from civilization was a weekend camping trip in college that ended early, when my friend Alex couldn't handle the absence of Wi-Fi. But after my sister's disappearance in Seattle and the subsequent investigation that went nowhere, I needed distance. Not just physical distance, but something primal, a severing from the world that failed her. The ranger position at Glacier seemed perfect, remote, demanding, and isolated. Seasonal backcountry ranger needed for Northwestern Sector, the listing read, must be self-sufficient and comfortable with extended periods of solitude. When I interviewed the chief ranger, a weathered man named Richard Blackriver, studied me with eyes that had seen decades of wilderness. "You don't have the experience," he said bluntly, reviewing my application. "But something tells me you need this more than we need another expert." His gaze lingered on me. This sector includes Kintla Lake. The Kootenai people called it Napi Kintla, where the mountain spirit sits. Not many rangers request this post. "I'm not superstitious," I replied. A smile flickered across his face. Neither was the last ranger. That conversation was 3 months ago. Now, as I steer my Forest Service truck along the rutted dirt road, the mid-October air bites with early winter's teeth. My assignment? The most remote outpost in the park, a solitary cabin near Kintla Lake, where I'd spend the autumn months monitoring wildlife populations and patrolling for illegal activity before the heavy snows made the area inaccessible. The cabin emerges from between lodgepole pines, dark timber weathered by decades of Montana winters. It's smaller than I expected, but solid. Solar panels on the roof, a radio antenna, and a small porch facing the still waters of Kintla. The lake stretches like polished obsidian toward mountains that rise abruptly from its shores, their peaks already crowned with snow. I unlock the door, releasing the scent of wood smoke and dust. A wooden desk beneath the window contains the logbook, maps, and wildlife observation records. A cast-iron stove dominates the main room, with a kitchen area, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed tucked into the corner. The walls are decorated with faded photographs of the park and Native American artwork depicting animals and spirits. After unloading my supplies, I radio my arrival to dispatch. The voice on the other end crackles through. "Copy that. Next scheduled check-in is 0800 tomorrow. Weather system moving in tomorrow night. Over." Understood. Over and out. That night, I sit on the porch watching darkness consume the mountains. The silence is absolute, a heavy physical thing pressing against my ears. No traffic noise, no distant conversations, no hum of electronics. Just wind through pines and occasional loon calls echoing across the lake. I came here to escape my thoughts. But in this silence, they grow louder. Images of my sister's apartment untouched since her disappearance. The detectives practiced sympathy as the case grew cold. My parents' faces, aging visibly with each passing month. A long, wavering howl breaks my reverie, not a wolf, but something that raises the hair on my arms. Higher pitched, almost human, but stretched and distorted. I've studied the wildlife reports for this region. Wolf packs, mountain lions, bears, lynx. Nothing that would make a sound like that. I step back inside, securing the door. The logbook catches my eye. Flipping through the previous ranger's entries, I note the professional tone documenting wildlife sightings, maintenance issues, and weather patterns. But the final entries from late August show a shift. August 27th. Strange tracks by North Shore. Too narrow for bear. Impressions too deep for something its size. August 28th. Heard unusual vocalizations, 0300 HRs. Animal possibly in distress. August 29th. Something circled cabin last night. Radio communication officer Bennett tomorrow about increased wildlife activity. The final entry, dated August 30th, contains a single line. They're watching from the trees. According to the staff records, the previous ranger requested immediate transfer on August 31st. No reason provided. I closed the logbook, attributing his notes to the psychological strain of isolation. During training, they warned us about cabin fever, how the mind can bend under the weight of solitude and wilderness. That night, I dream of my sister walking into Kintla Lake, her body dissolving into black water as antlers sprout from her head. I call out, but my voice makes no sound in the dream silence. I wake shivering despite the warmth of my sleeping bag. The digital clock reads 3:17 a.m. Beyond the window, the waning moon illuminates the lake, casting silver light across its surface. A shadow moves between trees at the shoreline, tall and thin, too tall for a person. I blink, and it's gone. Convincing myself it was a combination of unfamiliar surroundings and the lingering dream, I try to fall back asleep. But my mind returns to the previous ranger's final entry. They're watching from the trees. Morning brings rationality with the light. I spend the day familiarizing myself with patrol routes and organizing supplies. The two-way radio occasionally crackles with communications between other rangers and dispatch, reminding me I'm not completely alone. That afternoon, I hike along the lakeshore. The autumn forest smells of pine resin and decaying leaves. I record wildlife signs, wolf tracks in mud, bear claw marks on aspen trunks, a moose browsing in a marshy inlet. Everything normal, expected, until I find the carcass. Hidden in a thicket of young fir trees, a deer, or what remains of one. The killing itself isn't unusual. Predation is nature's way. But something about this feels wrong. The rib cage is splayed open, organs removed with what appears to be precision rather than animal feeding. Long, deep cuts run along the flesh, not matching any predator I recognize. No signs of feeding, just methodical dissection. Most disturbing are the tracks surrounding it. Narrow, deep impressions with elongated toes, almost human-like but not quite. They match the description in the previous ranger's notes. The radio at my hip buzzes. Kintla Outpost, this is dispatch. Weather alert, storm system intensifying. Expect heavy snow by 2,200 HRs, possible communication disruptions. Acknowledge. I press the talk button. Dispatch Kintla Outpost, message received. Recommend you return to shelter, Ranger. This one's moving in fast. Looking at the darkening sky, I nod to myself. Copy that. Heading back now. I photograph the carcass and tracks before leaving, though something tells me the coming storm will erase all evidence by morning. Back at the cabin, I secure the shutters and check my supplies. The barometer has dropped sharply. Through the window, I watch clouds devour the mountain peaks like hungry mouths. The temperature plummets as darkness falls. Wind moans around the cabin's corners, and the first hard pellets of snow strike the roof like tiny fists. I build a fire in the stove, its warmth comforting against the gathering storm. As I prepare a simple dinner, I think about the deer carcass and those strange tracks. I've heard whispers among the native staff about ancient things in these mountains, beings that hunger endlessly through the winter months. Old stories, they'd say, unwilling to elaborate further. The storm intensifies, shrieking now. Between gusts, I hear something else. A high, keening wail that doesn't match the wind's voice. It sounds like pain and hunger woven together, closer to the cabin than before. I reach for the radio, but catch only static. The storm has cut communications earlier than expected. Outside, something scrapes against the cabin wall. A branch, I tell myself, just a branch in the wind. But I know better. No trees stand that close to the cabin. The scraping moves toward the door, then stops. In the sudden silence, a voice calls my name. My name shouldn't be known to anything in these woods. I've been at this post less than 24 hours, yet there it is again, my name, spoken in a voice that sounds like dry leaves scraping across stone. It comes from just outside the door, barely audible above the howling wind. I reach for my service pistol, a 9mm Glock that now seems woefully inadequate against whatever waits in the darkness. The regulations manual never covered this situation. Park Service, identify yourself, I call out, trying to mask the tremor in my voice with authority. Silence answers, stretching for so long I begin to doubt what I heard. Then comes a sound like nails, dragging down the wooden door, followed by something heavy pressing against it. The old hinges creak in protest. I back away, weapon raised. I am armed and authorized to use lethal force. The pressure on the door releases. Footsteps, if you could call them that, circle the cabin. a strange cadence of something not quite walking upright. The shuttered windows rattle as something tests each one methodically. The radio crackles suddenly to life with a burst of static, making me jump. Through the interference, I catch fragments. Reports of North Sector, missing hikers remain indoors. Then, nothing. The storm has reclaimed the airwaves. Missing hikers. The words echo in my mind as I maintain my vigil through the night, listening to whatever prowls outside, testing the cabin's defenses. Occasionally it calls my name again, the pronunciation growing more accurate each time, as if learning how to shape human sounds. Dawn breaks with unexpected stillness. The storm has passed, leaving nearly 2 feet of fresh snow blanketing everything. No tracks surround the cabin. The snowfall has erased any evidence of my nighttime visitor. I radio dispatch as soon as signal returns. Kintla outpost to dispatch, over. A pause, then. Go ahead, Kintla. I received a partial transmission last night about missing hikers in the North Sector. Can you confirm? Another pause, longer this time. Affirmative. 2 backpackers missed their check-in 3 days ago. Last known location near Upper Kintla Lake. Search teams are assembling at West Glacier. You're to remain at your post and report any sightings. I may have had unusual activity near my location last night. What kind of activity? How do I explain a voice that knew my name, scratching at my door from something that moved like neither man nor beast? Possibly wildlife, possibly human, hard to determine in the storm. Could be related to your missing hikers. Copy that. Document anything unusual according to protocol. Search teams will reach your sector by tomorrow if weather holds. After signing off, I check my maps. Upper Kintla Lake lies 5 miles north of my position. A day's hike in good conditions, longer in fresh snow. Despite orders to remain at my post, I feel drawn to investigate. If hikers are stranded, the delay could prove fatal in these temperatures. I decide on a compromise. A reconnaissance patrol partway toward Upper Kintla, returning before nightfall. Gearing up with emergency supplies, extra ammunition, a satellite beacon, and snowshoes, I set out along the patrol route. The forest stands eerily silent under its white burden, branches hanging low with snow. My breath clouds before me as I push forward, breaking trail through pristine powder. 2 hours in, I discover the first sign of something amiss. A torn fragment of orange fabric snagged on a pine branch, too vibrant to be anything but human-made. A short distance beyond, I find a single snowshoe, partially buried. The binding is snapped, not worn through, broken with significant force. I document both findings, marking their GPS coordinates. Standard procedure indicates I should continue only far enough to determine if immediate rescue is possible, then return to base and report. 100 yards ahead, the trees thin around a small clearing. At its center stands something that stops me cold. A crude structure of branches and bones has been erected, 6 feet tall and arranged in a rough pyramid. Animal skulls, deer, elk, and what appears to be wolf, are woven into the framework. At its apex, most disturbing of all, is a backpack. Dark stains spatter the fabric. This isn't the work of wildlife, nor does it resemble any legitimate human activity, recreational, scientific, or indigenous. This is something else entirely. As I photograph the structure, the hair at my nape rises. The silence has deepened, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. Even the winter birds have gone quiet. I'm being watched. Slowly, I turn in a complete circle, scanning the tree line. Nothing moves, yet the sensation of eyes upon me intensifies. My training tells me to announce my presence. Park Service Ranger, if anyone is out there, identify yourself. My voice falls dead in the snow-laden air. No echo, no response. Then I see it, halfway up a towering pine at the clearing's edge. A figure clinging to the trunk, so still it might be mistaken for a growth on the tree. Humanoid, but wrong. Limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. Its skin, where visible between rags of clothing, appears gray and stretched tight over its frame. Most horrifying is its posture, head twisted completely backward to stare down at me with eyes I cannot see clearly at this distance, but scents are fixed unblinkingly on mine. My training evaporates. Primitive instinct takes over, and I run. I abandon any pretense of professional calm, crashing through the forest back toward the cabin. Branches whip my face, snowshoes tangling in underbrush. Twice I fall, scrambling up with snow coating my clothes. I don't look back, can't bear to see if it's following. The cabin appears through the trees like salvation. I burst through the door, securing it behind me with trembling hands. Only then, with solid walls between us, do I try to process what I've seen. The creature matches no known wildlife. Its movements, its construction of that macabre shrine, its deliberate positioning, all suggest intelligence, but not human intelligence. Something older, something hungry. I radio dispatch again, struggling to keep my voice steady as I report finding signs of the missing hikers and requesting immediate search team deployment. I make no mention of the creature. How could I describe it without sounding unhinged? Search teams will reach your location by noon tomorrow, dispatch confirms. Maintain your position. Night falls with excruciating slowness. I check and recheck the doors and windows, pile extra firewood beside the stove, and keep my weapon within reach. The satellite phone and emergency beacon sit on the table, final lifelines to the outside world. As darkness deepens, the temperature plummets again. Wind rises, not storm force but steady, moaning through the trees. I try to distract myself by reviewing the photos I took. The fabric scrap, the abandoned snowshoe, the bone structure with its grisly crown. In the final image, something catches my eye that I missed in my panic. Zooming in on the photo of the structure, I notice markings carved into the largest bone, symbols that appear deliberate. I grab the cabin's reference books, flipping through sections on local indigenous cultures. There, in a chapter on Kootenai and Blackfeet folklore, I find similar symbols associated with winter spirits, specifically a being called the Wendigo. The text describes it as a malevolent entity born of starvation and cannibalism, never satisfied, always hunting. Those who hear it speak their name are already marked, the passage warns. A scratching at the window shutters interrupts my reading. Soft at first, then more insistent, I sit frozen, listening as it moves methodically around the cabin again, testing each potential entrance. The radio crackles unexpectedly. Kintla Outpost. Respond. I lunge for it. This is Kintla Outpost. We've signal from emergency beacon. Activated. My blood runs cold. The emergency beacon sits untouched on the table before me. I haven't activated it. Repeat your message. My beacon is not activated. I repeat, not activated. The response comes through broken static. Beacon signal, Upper Kintla, search team diverted. Understanding dawns with horrifying clarity. Something has activated a beacon, possibly from one of the missing hikers, drawing the search team away from my location, deeper into the wilderness. Outside, the scratching stops. Then comes a sound that turns my insides to ice, a perfect imitation of my own voice, repeating my radio transmission word for word. Realization hits like a physical blow. The voice, the tracks, the shrine, all pieces of a pattern I'm only now recognizing. The previous ranger's final entry makes terrible sense. They're watching from the trees. This isn't just some predator. It's a hunter that studies its prey, learns their voices, knows their names. It's intelligent enough to use technology against us, luring help away from where it's needed. And it's learning. The voice outside shifts, no longer mine but a patchwork of others. Snippets of radio transmissions, calls for help, fragments of human speech stitched together into a grotesque approximation of communication. Help, location, emergency. Come quickly. I press myself against the far wall, as distant from the voice as possible. Through a crack in the shutters, moonlight illuminates a patch of snow outside. Into this patch steps a foot, gray, elongated, with too many joints and wickedly curved claws where toes should be. The legends were right. The Wendigo has found me, and it's calling for others to join the feast. Morning arrives after the longest night of my life. I've dozed in fitful bursts, startling awake at every sound, pistol in hand. My shoulders ache from tension, eyes burning from lack of proper sleep. The radio remains ominously silent. According to the last transmission, search teams should be investigating the false beacon signal near Upper Kintla, miles from here, and hours from realizing they've been lured into a trap. I check my satellite phone. No service flashes mockingly. The storm must have damaged a relay station somewhere. I'm effectively cut off. Outside, fresh snow has again erased whatever tracks might have revealed my nocturnal visitor. The forest looks deceptively peaceful, sunlight sparkling on unblemished white. But now I know better. The beauty conceals something ancient and calculating. I need information, something beyond the brief folklore mentions in the cabin's reference materials. Searching the shelves, I discover a locked drawer in the desk. It takes several minutes of searching before I find the key, taped beneath the drawer itself. Inside lies a leather-bound journal, much older than the standard-issue logbooks. The name inside reads, Benjamin Longwalker, Tribal Liaison, 1,978 to 1,989 inches. The pages contain detailed notes on local indigenous beliefs regarding the glacier region, particularly the areas around Kintla. I read with growing unease. The Kootenai elder explained that Napi Kintla was considered forbidden ground during winter months. The hunger walks there when snow covers the ground, she told me. It was born in the time of great starvation, when men consumed what they should not. Now it consumes in turn. I pressed for details on the nature of this entity. She was reluctant but eventually described a being that begins as something like a spirit, but gradually becomes more physical as it feeds, taking parts of its victims. Not just flesh, but voices, knowledge, even mannerisms. It collects, she said. It builds itself from what it takes. The more it feeds, the more human it appears, until it can walk among us. But look carefully at its eyes and joints, those it cannot disguise. Most disturbing was her warning about its hunting methods. It will study before it strikes, learn your patterns, your voice, call your name in the dark. Build markers of bones to claim territory. Once it knows your name, you are already in its stomach. Further entries detail Longwalker's growing obsession with these legends, culminating in his own winter expedition to Upper Kintla in 1989, from which he never returned. A final note from the park superintendent indicates the journal was preserved for historical record, but classified as potentially disturbing folklore without scientific merit. I closed the journal, hands trembling. What the previous ranger encountered, what I'm facing now, has been documented before, only to be dismissed and forgotten. And it has been hunting in these woods for decades, perhaps centuries. A decision crystallizes. I cannot remain here waiting for rescue that might arrive too late, if at all. The search teams need to be warned about what they're truly tracking. And if this entity is focused on me, leading it away from the cabin might give the missing hikers a chance, should they still be alive. I pack essential survival gear, ammunition, the satellite phone in hopes of finding signal elsewhere, and Longwalker's journal. I leave a detailed report of my findings and intentions in the logbook, though I doubt my sanity as I write about bone shrines and creatures that steal voices. Before departing, I rig an early warning system, fishing lines strung with empty cans around the cabin perimeter. If something approaches after I've gone, at least I'll know which direction to avoid upon return. The temperature has risen slightly, making the snow heavy and wet as I trudge northwest, deliberately away from the Upper Kintla area where the search team should be operating. My goal is to reach the ridge overlooking Kishinen Creek, where the higher elevation might allow satellite communication. 2 hours into my trek, I notice the tracks. They appear gradually. First, just a suggestion of disturbance in the snow several hundred yards behind me. Then, more distinct impressions. Something is following, mirroring my path with uncanny precision. It stays just far enough back to remain hidden among the trees, but close enough to maintain pursuit. I quicken my pace, pushing through knee-deep snow until sweat soaks my inner layers despite the cold. The ridge appears ahead, its slopes steeper and more treacherous than they appeared on the map. As I begin the ascent, a sound reaches me, carried on the wind like a terrible parody of human distress. Help, please, injured. The voice shifts between genders and ages, a hideous collage of stolen pleas. It knows I'm a ranger, trained to respond to such calls. It's trying to use my duty against me. I press on, scrambling up the increasingly vertical slope. The satellite phone remains stubbornly without service. The ridgetop seems to recede with each labored step. Behind me, the calls grow more desperate, more specific. Please, my leg. I can see you. Ranger, help me. I glance back once and wish I hadn't. Something moves between the trees below, keeping pace. Tall and gaunt, it walks with a jerking gait on legs that bend wrong. From this distance, I can't make out details of its face, but I feel its gaze locked onto mine. When it realizes I've spotted it, it abandons pretense. The human-like calls transform into a shrill, keening howl that echoes across the valley. Fear gives me new strength. I claw my way up the final stretch of ridge, boots slipping on hidden ice beneath the snow. At the crest, wind whips across the exposed rock, nearly knocking me sideways. I stumble to the highest point, desperately checking the phone. One bar of service appears. It's enough. My fingers shake so badly I can barely dial dispatch. When the connection establishes, I speak rapidly, words tumbling over one another. This is Kintla Outpost Ranger. Emergency situation. Search teams are being led into a trap. The beacon signal is false. Repeat. Do not approach Upper Kintla. Hostile entity in the area has lured. The line goes dead. Looking up, I realize why. It stands 30 yards away on the ridgeline, no longer hiding among trees, no longer mimicking human movement. In the unforgiving daylight, I finally see the Wendigo clearly. Its frame towers nearly 8 feet tall, impossibly thin, yet corded with stringy muscle. The skin stretches gray and taut over a skeleton that seems too large and wrongly proportioned. Arms hang to its knees, ending in hands with elongated fingers tipped with yellowed claws. Its legs bend backward at the knee, with a second joint midway up the thigh that no human possesses. Most horrifying is its face, a skull-like visage with skin pulled so tight that each ridge and hollow of the bone beneath is visible. Its mouth extends too wide, filled with jagged, mismatched teeth. Some appear human, others decidedly not. But its eyes are the worst. Black and unblinking, they reflect nothing, absorb everything. They are holes into endless hunger. Around its emaciated frame hang tattered remnants of clothing, some pieces recognizably recent, others so weathered they might be decades old. A torn orange jacket that matches the fabric scrap I found. A ranger's hat, faded and blood-stained. It tilts its head at an impossible angle, studying me with those terrible eyes. Then it speaks, using a patchwork of voices. Ranger, help has arrived. Its mouth doesn't move correctly with the words, as if it hasn't quite mastered the mechanics of human speech despite stealing the sounds. I raise my pistol with both hands, knowing even as I do that bullets may be useless against something born of starvation and spirit rather than flesh. Stay back. My voice sounds thin and frightened in the mountain air. It takes a step forward, joints creaking like old wood. A sound emerges from its throat, something between a laugh and a howl. It gestures toward the valley below with one elongated hand. Others, coming, hungry too. Horror washes through me as I understand. It isn't alone. I fire twice before turning to run along the ridgeline. The shots echo across the mountains, but I don't stay to see if they had any effect. The ridge extends eastward, eventually connecting to a fire road that leads back toward the main ranger station, if I can reach it. Behind me, that terrible howl rises again, answered by similar cries from different points in the valley. The Wendigo is calling its brethren. The hunt has begun in earnest. I run faster than I thought possible, leaping across gaps in the ridge, sliding down scree slopes, using my ice axe to catch myself where footing fails. The knowledge that I am prey, that something ancient and patient and hungry knows my name, drives me beyond normal human limits. As I navigate a particularly treacherous section, my foot slips. The world tilts sickeningly as I slide toward the edge. My hands scrabble for purchase, finding none on the ice-slicked rock. I plummet over the side, tumbling down the steep slope below. Pain explodes through my side as I collide with a protruding boulder. The world spins in a chaos of snow, sky, and rock. When I finally stop rolling, I lie dazed at the bottom of a shallow ravine. Everything hurts. Warm wetness seeps through my jacket, blood from a gash in my side. My left ankle throbs with what must be at least a severe sprain. The satellite phone lies shattered nearby. I struggle to rise, knowing I can't stay here. The fall has bought me minutes at most. Using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch, I limp forward, following the ravine. Each step sends shards of pain through my body. Blood leaves a damning trail behind me in the snow. The light is fading faster than it should. I check my watch, only mid-afternoon. Looking up, I see heavy clouds gathering again. Another storm approaches. I need shelter. In my current condition, exposure will kill me before the Wendigo gets its chance. As if summoned by my desperation, a dark opening appears in the ravine wall ahead. A narrow cave entrance, barely visible behind a screen of pine branches. I approach cautiously, drawing my pistol again. If this is a den of some natural predator, it would be a quicker death than what pursues me. The entrance leads to a tight passage that widens after several feet. I squeeze through, using my flashlight to probe the darkness beyond. The beam reveals a small chamber, perhaps 15 feet across. Dry, sheltered, and most importantly, defensible. The narrow entrance would force anything entering to come through one at a time. As my light sweeps the space, I freeze. Along the far wall, carefully arranged, is a row of backpacks. 4 of them in varying states of decay. Beside them lie boots, climbing gear, cameras, the possessions of hikers who sought shelter here before me. Against the wall slumps a skeleton, still clad in the tattered remains of a Park Service uniform. A name badge, tarnished but readable. B. Longwalker. I've found the tribal liaison who disappeared in 1989, and judging by the other items, he wasn't the last to die here. This isn't shelter, it's a larder. I turn to flee, but a familiar howl cuts through the gathering dusk outside. Too close. They've tracked me to the ravine already. Trapped between certain death outside and potential death within, I choose the devil I can see. I press myself against the wall beside the entrance, pistol raised, waiting. As darkness falls completely, the storm arrives with savage intensity. Wind screams through the ravine, driving snow and ice before it. Perfect hunting weather for creatures born of winter's hunger. In the howl of the blizzard, I hear them calling my name again, calling me to join the feast of the endless winter. And I wonder, as I grip my pistol with bloodied hands, if I'm guarding against something trying to enter, or if I've entered something's guard. The storm rages through the night, a relentless assault of wind and ice that seems almost sentient in its fury. Huddled in the cave, I battle blood loss and the creeping cold that threatens to lull me into final sleep. My side burns where the makeshift bandage covers the gash, and my ankle has swollen to twice its normal size. Longwalker's remains watch me with empty sockets from across the chamber. I've searched the packs left by previous victims, finding some supplies that might prolong my survival. Water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit with actual painkillers and antibiotics. Small mercies. Most valuable is a weather-beaten notebook found in Longwalker's pack. His final entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, detail his discoveries about the Wendigo. January 17, 1989. The tribal elders weren't telling stories. They were issuing warnings. What walks these woods in winter is neither beast nor man, but something that remembers being both. I've tracked it for 3 days, or perhaps it has tracked me. January 19th. It builds markers of bone to establish territory. These aren't just trophies, they're navigation aids. Some ancient intelligence has learned to leave messages for others of its kind. They're coordinating their hunts. January 20th. They were human once. That's the horror of it. Starvation in these mountains drove them to consume their companions. The act itself opened a door for something older to enter. Native lore says the spirit of winter hunger takes them, but I wonder if it's something they awaken within themselves, some dormant evolutionary remnant from when we were more predator than person. January 21st. They cannot be killed by conventional means. Bullets slow them, fire frightens them. But to truly destroy one, you must understand what created it. It is hunger incarnate. It is starvation given form. To end it, the entry trails off into a dark smudge. The next page is blank, except for a hastily drawn symbol, a circle bisected by a vertical line with smaller circles at each quadrant. I study this final communication from a man who understood what he faced far better than I do. What was he trying to convey? To truly destroy one, you must understand what created it. The Wendigo is born of starvation and cannibalism, the ultimate taboo transformed into cursed existence. Outside, something scrapes along the ravine wall. The sound freezes my blood more effectively than the plummeting temperature. It's searching, methodical, patient. It knows I'm wounded. It can smell the blood. I check my ammunition, 4 rounds remaining. Not enough to fight off multiple creatures, especially if bullets merely slow them rather than kill them. The scraping stops directly outside the cave entrance. Snow swirls in the opening, backlit by a strange pale luminescence that seems to emanate from nowhere and everywhere in the storm-dark night. A shadow eclipses this glow, something crouching to peer inside. I raise my pistol, aiming at the narrow opening. A voice drifts in, not the patchwork speech from before, but something more coherent, more practiced. It has been learning. "Ranger, you're bleeding. The scent travels far in cold air." I remain silent, finger tensed on the trigger. Others coming soon, hungry after long summer sleep. But I found you first. A pause then. "Cave has 1 entrance, 1 exit. You've chosen poorly." The calculated intelligence behind these words terrifies me more than any bestial growl could. This isn't mindless predation. This is sadistic hunting. Benjamin made the same mistake, it continues, using Longwalker's first name with disturbing familiarity. He thought he could study us, understand us, but in the end, we understood him, added his knowledge to ours. My mind races. If it absorbed Longwalker's knowledge, it knows everything he discovered about Wendigo strengths and weaknesses, including how to destroy them. I glance at the symbol in the notebook again. Something about its design tugs at my memory, similar to figures I've seen in the reference materials back at the cabin. The creature shifts position outside, joints creaking audibly. "The storm will last until morning. Your core temperature drops with each hour. Soon moving will become difficult, then impossible." It's right. Hypothermia is setting in despite my layers. I need to act before weakness claims me completely. "Why speak to me at all?" I call out, trying to keep it engaged while I think. "Why not just attack?" A sound like branches breaking, its version of laughter. The fear seasons the meat, and I am curious. You Rangers come to study nature. Now nature studies you. While it speaks, I frantically sketch Longwalker's symbol on the cave floor using a charred stick from my emergency fire kit, the circle with its bisecting line and 4 smaller circles. What could it mean? Then it hits me. The symbol resembles crude compass points. North, south, east, west, with a central dividing line. Longwalker wasn't drawing a mystical sigil, he was making a map. I flip through the notebook again, scanning earlier entries where he mentions bone markers serving as navigation aids. The Wendigo build these structures not just as territory claims, but as signposts for others of their kind. A terrible inspiration strikes. If they use these markers to communicate and coordinate, perhaps the symbols can be used against them. "You're not natural," I call out, needing to keep it talking. "You're a perversion, a mistake." The creature hisses. "We are the oldest law. When food grows scarce, the strong consume the weak. Your people have forgotten this truth, hidden it behind civilization. But the hunger remembers. If you're so strong, why hide in the storm? Why not come in and take me?" Another bone-cracking laugh. Patient hunter catches the fattest prey. While we exchange words, I tear a page from the notebook and hastily redraw the symbol, adding embellishments based on fragments I recall from the cabin's reference books, marks that signify warning or danger in local indigenous pictographs. The creature grows impatient. Enough talk, the others approach. They will not be as conversational. I hear it then. Distant howls carried on the storm winds. More Wendigo, answering the call of their packmate. It's now or never. I strike my emergency flare, the sudden magnesium flare brilliant in the darkness. The creature recoils from the entrance with a shriek, giving me the seconds I need. I lunge forward despite my injuries, thrusting the burning flare and marked paper toward the opening. "Tell your brothers the hunting ground is cursed," I shout, letting the paper float into the storm. The symbols of Kintla mark this place as poison. I have no idea if this desperate bluff will work. I'm banking on their intelligence, their superstition, their absorption of human fears and beliefs through the victims they've consumed over decades. The Wendigo retreats several steps, its tall form briefly illuminated by the flare's harsh light. In that moment, I see its face clearly, the stretched skin, the too wide mouth, but also something new, a flicker of uncertainty in those bottomless eyes. It snatches the burning paper from the air, studying the symbol with its head tilted at an unnatural angle. A long, low sound emerges from its throat, neither human nor animal, but something ancient and considering. Then it speaks, voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carries through the howling storm. Clever meat, using old marks against us. It crumples the paper in elongated fingers. But false warnings only work once. It turns its head toward the distant howls, then back to me. For a terrible moment, I think it will call my bluff immediately. Instead, it backs away into the swirling snow. Others will come regardless, but you've earned ours, not safety. Its final words drift back as it disappears into the white chaos. Use them wisely, the hunger always returns. The flare sputters and dies, plunging the ravine back into darkness. I collapse against the cave wall, trembling with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. The reprieve won't last long. Once the other Wendigo arrive, they'll recognize the deception and resume their hunt with redoubled fury. I need to move while I still can. The storm provides cover in both directions, hiding me from them, but also them from me. If I leave now, I might reach the fire road before dawn. Gathering my meager supplies and Long Walker's notebook, I prepare to venture back into the blizzard. Before leaving, I pause beside his remains. Thank you, I whisper to the bones of a man who faced these horrors alone. I'll make sure they know what hunts these mountains. Outside, the storm has intensified to whiteout conditions. The cold bites through my layers instantly, but I force myself forward, using the ravine walls for guidance. Each step on my injured ankle sends spikes of pain up my leg, but fear drives me onward. I navigate by instinct and fragments of ranger training on winter survival. The fire road should lie 2 miles east, following the ravine until it opens into a wider valley. In clear conditions, a straightforward hike. In this blizzard, with predators tracking me, it might as well be 100 miles. An hour into this desperate journey, the howls begin again. Closer now, converging from multiple directions. My deception has been discovered. The hunt resumes. I quicken my pace as much as my injuries allow, abandoning caution for speed. The ravine begins to widen, suggesting I'm nearing the valley. Hope flickers dimly through exhaustion and cold. Then I see them. Dark silhouettes moving through the curtain of snow ahead, cutting off my path. 3 tall figures, walking with that distinctive wrong-jointed gait. Too late, I realize my mistake. They've anticipated my route, positioned themselves to intercept me. I drop to the snow, extinguishing my flashlight. The darkness is now my only ally, though a poor one against creatures that hunt by scent and sound as much as sight. Crawling backward, I seek any alternate route. The ravine walls on either side are too steep to climb in my condition. I'm trapped in a natural funnel with Wendigo at its mouth. As I press against the ravine wall, seeking any recess or feature that might offer concealment, my hand brushes against something that doesn't belong. A metal surface, rectangular and cold even compared to the surrounding air. Tracing its outline in the darkness, I recognize a maintenance access door built into the rock face, likely connected to one of the park's water monitoring stations. These remote stations dot the backcountry, collecting data on snowmelt and runoff. The lock has long since rusted, but the door holds firm against my initial push. Desperation lending strength, I slam my shoulder against it repeatedly until something gives way with a shriek of protesting metal. The door swings inward, revealing a narrow concrete passage. Without hesitation, I squeeze inside, pulling the damaged door closed behind me as best I can. The passage extends perhaps 30 feet before opening into a small chamber filled with outdated monitoring equipment. A thick layer of dust suggests no human has visited in years, but the structure is solid, insulated concrete designed to withstand Montana's harshest weather. Most importantly, it has no windows and only the single entrance through which I came. defensible, if not escape-proof. I collapse onto the floor, my body finally giving in to exhaustion and blood loss. The room spins around me as I fumble with the first aid kit, injecting myself with the single dose of morphine reserved for extreme emergencies. As the pain recedes to a dull throb, I hear them outside, scratching, sniffing, testing the metal door. Their voices have abandoned all pretense of humanity now, communicating in guttural sounds that might be their true language. The door shudders as something heavy slams against it. Another impact follows, then another. The hinges won't withstand a concentrated assault for long. In the dim light of my flashlight, I take stock of my surroundings, searching for anything useful. The equipment is dead. No power, no communication capability. A maintenance cabinet yields basic tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, a propane torch for thawing frozen pipes. The torch gives me an idea. Longwalker wrote that fire frightens them. I have limited fuel, but perhaps enough to create a defensive barrier. I position myself facing the door, the torch in one hand, my pistol with its 4 remaining bullets in the other. If I'm to die here, I'll make my final stand count. The pounding intensifies. Metal groans as the door begins to buckle inward. Through the widening gaps, I glimpse gray skin and reaching claws. Then, impossibly, another sound cuts through the Wendigo's assault, the mechanical rumble of engines. Powerful beams of light sweep the ravine outside, accompanied by human voices shouting commands. The search teams have found me. The Wendigo's attack on the door ceases immediately. Their howls transform into sounds of rage and frustration as they retreat from the approaching rescuers. Hope surges through me, but caution tempers it. The Wendigo won't abandon their hunt so easily. They'll withdraw temporarily, circle back when opportunity presents itself, and the search team has no idea what awaits them in these mountains. I pound on the inside of the damaged door, shouting with what strength remains in my voice. "Over here! Ranger in the monitoring station. Proceed with extreme caution." Flashlight beams converge on the door. I hear the blessed sound of human voices responding. "We hear you. Stand back. We're coming in." As they work to open the jammed door, I clutch Longwalker's notebook tightly. His final warning will not be lost again. The world must know what hungers in the winter mountains of Glacier National Park. The Wendigo may retreat with the arrival of many humans, but they won't abandon their hunting grounds. They'll wait for the next solitary hiker, the next isolated ranger. Patient predators playing the long game they've mastered over centuries. The door finally gives way, revealing the welcome sight of Park Service uniforms and search and rescue gear. As they rush in with medical equipment and blankets, I try to form words of warning to explain the danger still lurking in the storm. But exhaustion claims me at last. The notebook slips from my fingers as darkness closes in. My last conscious thought, the hunger always returns. I awake to the steady beep of monitoring equipment and the antiseptic smell of hospital. Sunlight streams through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across sterile white sheets. For several disorienting moments, I can't reconcile this sterility with my last memories of howling Wendigo and driving snow. A nurse notices my consciousness and approaches with professional warmth. "Welcome back. You've been our guest for 3 days now." 3 days. I try to speak, but my throat feels like sandpaper. She offers ice chips, which I accept gratefully. "The search team found you just in time," she continues, checking my vitals. "Severe hypothermia, blood loss, infected wounds. Another few hours." She leaves the sentence unfinished, its conclusion obvious. "The others," I manage to rasp. "Did they find anyone else?" A shadow crosses her face. "I should let the doctor know you're awake." Before she can leave, I grab her wrist with surprising strength. "Please, I need to know." She hesitates, then sighs. "They found the bodies of 2 hikers near Upper Kintla Lake and remains of someone else. Older. They're still conducting identifications. Benjamin Longwalker. After 36 years, he'll finally return home." A park ranger appears in the doorway, Richard Blackriver, the chief who hired me. His weathered face shows relief at my recovery, but something else lurks behind his eyes. Wariness, perhaps, or recognition. "You're one tough rookie," he says, approaching the bed. "Most experienced rangers wouldn't have survived what you endured." When the nurse leaves, his expression shifts subtly. He places something on the bedside table. Longwalker's notebook, retrieved from the monitoring station. "You had this clutched in your hand when they found you," he says quietly. "I've read it." I study his face, searching for disbelief or skepticism. Instead, I find grim confirmation. "You know," I whisper, "about what's out there." He glances toward the door to ensure our privacy. "The Kootenai called that region Napi Kintla for a reason, where the mountain spirit sits. My grandmother told me stories about the hunger spirits when I was a child. I thought they were just tales to keep kids from wandering too far." "They're real," I say, the words sounding absurd in this modern hospital room, yet undeniable after what I've witnessed. "What did you see out there?" he asks, his voice dropping further. I tell him everything. The bone markers, the voices that knew my name, the creatures that moved with broken-jointed grace through blizzard conditions that would kill humans. I describe their intelligence, their calculation, their patient hunting methods. He listens without interruption, without the skepticism I'd expect from any other law enforcement official. When I finish, he's silent for a long moment. "The official report states you encountered hostile wildlife, possibly wolves or bears driven to unusual aggression by hunger and winter conditions. You suffered injuries during evasive action and hallucinations due to hypothermia and blood loss." My heart sinks. The same dismissal Longwalker faced decades ago. "You don't believe that?" "What I believe doesn't matter," he replies carefully. "What matters is what goes into official records, what the public and administration are prepared to accept. People need to know the danger," I insist. "Those hikers were found partially consumed by what the coroner will rule as predatory animal activity post-mortem," he interrupts. "The same conclusion reached in similar cases over the decades." Anger flares through my weakness. "So we just pretend, let more people die?" Black River sighs heavily, suddenly looking much older. "No, we protect them in ways they'll accept. Increased patrols during winter months, stricter enforcement of backcountry permits, better emergency response protocols." He taps Longwalker's notebook. "And we preserve knowledge for those who need it." He reaches into his jacket and produces a small leather pouch adorned with traditional beadwork. "My grandmother gave me this when I became chief ranger. Inside is sage, sweetgrass, and other sacred plants. She said it would protect me if I ever heard my name called in the forest when no one was there." He places it beside the notebook. "I've never needed it, but I think you might if you choose to stay." "Stay?" I echo incredulously. "After what happened?" His eyes meet mine, intense and evaluating. "That's your choice. Most would request immediate transfer. No one would question it after your traumatic wildlife encounter." The quotation marks are audible in his tone. "But some, a very few, understand that knowing the danger makes them better guardians, not just of the park, but of the people who visit it." I remember the Wendigo's words, "The fear seasons the meat." They feed not just on flesh, but on terror, on ignorance, on the shock of encountering something that shouldn't exist. "The search teams," I say suddenly. "Did they see anything?" Black River's expression tightens. "Two members reported unusual sounds during the rescue. One described a tall figure watching from the tree line that disappeared when approached. Their statements were attributed to poor visibility and stress. But they saw, they heard. The knowledge exists now in more minds, however rationalized or dismissed." "What do you think they are?" I ask. "Really?" He considers this carefully. "My grandmother believed they were once human. Starving trappers, lost explorers, stranded travelers who crossed a moral line out of desperation. The act of consuming human flesh opened a door that let something older in, something that existed before people, that remembered when we were prey rather than predators. Can they be killed? Traditional stories say fire purifies them, consuming their consumer." He shrugs slightly. "But modern weapons? I don't know. The notebook might hold answers Longwalker never got to test." A doctor appears at the doorway, ending our conversation. Black River stands, placing a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Rest, recover. When you're ready, we'll talk about your future with the Park Service." He moves toward the door, then pauses. "Whatever you decide, that notebook and pouch are yours now. Some knowledge is earned through suffering. The following weeks pass in a blur of medical treatments, debriefings, and psychological evaluations. I stick to the official story: wildlife encounter, survival situation, hallucinations from exposure. My physical wounds heal faster than the invisible ones. Dreams haunt my nights. Elongated figures moving through blizzards, voices calling my name with impossible knowledge, eyes black as winter midnights tracking me across snow-covered mountains. I'm offered a transfer to any national park of my choice, with commendations for survival against extraordinary odds. A fresh start, away from the shadows of Glacier. Instead, I request reassignment to the same sector, Kintla Lake, where the mountain spirit sits. The request raises eyebrows, prompts additional psychological evaluation, but Black River supports it, and eventually, approval comes through. Why return? The staff psychologist asks during our final session. Most people would want to put such a traumatic experience behind them. I give her the answer she needs for her report. Facing fears is the best way to overcome them. I don't want one bad experience to define my relationship with the wilderness I'm sworn to protect. The real answer lives in Longwalker's notebook, in the pouch of sacred plants, in the memory of those black, patient eyes. Knowledge creates responsibility. The Wendigo have hunted these mountains for centuries, claiming isolated victims whose disappearances are attributed to exposure, accidents, wildlife. Someone needs to know what truly hungers in the winter darkness. Someone needs to recognize the signs, bone markers, strange tracks, voices that know your name, and guide the innocent away from ancient appetites. Today, I return to Kintla Lake. The cabin has been repaired, equipped with better communications and emergency gear. Summer crowds have thinned as autumn paints the aspens gold. Soon the first snows will dust the peaks, then blanket the valleys. I stand on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains. The air carries the promise of winter, of silence, of hunger awakening from long sleep. Longwalker's notebook rests in my pack, its pages now supplemented with my own observations and theories. The leather pouch hangs around my neck. New traps and alarms surround the cabin perimeter, designed to alert me to visitors, human or otherwise. Night falls across Glacier National Park. In the distance, a lone wolf howls, a natural sound belonging to this world rather than the spaces between worlds where the Wendigo dwell. But beneath it, almost too faint to perceive, comes an answering call, higher-pitched, stretched wrong, mimicking rather than embodying. They remember me. They know I've returned. The winter will be long and deep, a perfect hunting ground for creatures patient enough to wait decades for their prey. I step inside, securing the door and windows. The radio crackles with routine park communications, weather updates, patrol check-ins, the comforting rhythm of human connection. Outside, beyond the light spilling from my windows, ancient hunger circles. Waiting, watching, learning. I open the notebook to a fresh page and begin to write. October 15th. I have returned to Kintla. The hunger remembers my name, but now I know its face. The winter will be a siege, a test of knowledge against appetite. This time I am prepared. This time I am hunting them. I never imagined that working as a park ranger would change my life forever. The position at Glacier National Park seemed like the perfect escape from my previous life in Seattle, a tech job that had burned me out completely, leaving me hollow and searching for something authentic. When the posting appeared online for a seasonal ranger at a remote station in the park's northern wilderness, I applied without hesitation. Something about the solitude, the promise of pristine nature, and the distance from everything that had drained me for years pulled at something deep within my soul. "You understand this isn't like the visitor centers, right?" Ranger Monroe asked during my interview, studying me with weathered eyes that had seen decades of mountain winters. Wapiti Ridge Outpost is our most isolated station. Nearest backup is 3 hours away in good weather. Winter comes early up there and stays late. "That's exactly what I'm looking for," I replied, meaning every word. 3 weeks later, I arrived at the small cabin that would be my home for the next 6 months. Perched on a rocky outcropping overlooking a valley of ancient pines, Wapiti Ridge Outpost was more isolated than even I had imagined. A deep, mirror-like lake stretched away to the east, reflecting the towering mountains that surrounded us on three sides. The cabin itself was rustic but functional: solar panels for minimal electricity, a radio system for emergencies, and a wood stove that would be my lifeline when winter descended. My responsibilities were straightforward: monitor the backcountry trails, assist any hikers in distress, track wildlife movements, and record environmental data. From October through March, I would be the only ranger within 20 miles of this section of the park. The autumn colors were already fading when I arrived, and the first snows would arrive within weeks. The Blackfoot people called this area Apikuni Awaksa Wipik Sa Kumitai, where the hungry spirits walk, Monroe told me during my orientation hike. They avoided hunting here, especially in winter. I nodded politely, attributing it to the same kind of folklore that surrounds any remote wilderness area. Every national park had its ghost stories and legends. Part of ranger training included learning about the cultural history of the land we stewarded, including the indigenous stories. You listen to the old stories, you hear them repeat across tribes that never contacted each other, Monroe continued, his voice dropping. The Cree, the Ojibwe, the Blackfoot, they all have stories about something in these mountains, something that hunts when the snow gets deep and food gets scarce. Wendigos, I said, remembering my research on local folklore. Monroe looked at me sharply. Don't say that name out here. Some things you don't invite. Just remember, if you're out on patrol and you hear someone calling for help, especially during a storm, make damn sure you know who's calling before you answer. I laughed nervously, but Monroe didn't join in. The first month passed uneventfully. October brought dwindling daylight and the last few hardy backpackers making their way through before winter closed the high country. I settled into a routine of morning radio check-ins, afternoon patrols, and evenings spent reading by lamplight or stargazing from my porch. The isolation that might have driven others to madness felt like a balm to my spirit. I slept better than I had in years. November arrived with the first serious snowfall, and the park transformed overnight. I woke to a world hushed and white, the familiar landscape rendered new and strange by 3 feet of powder. That morning, I couldn't raise anyone on the radio. The storm had knocked out communications temporarily. Standard procedure was to wait 24 hours before attempting the trek to the nearest ranger station, so I settled in and recorded weather data while the snow continued to fall. That night, the temperature plummeted to -20. I stoked the wood stove and huddled near its warmth, listening to the wind howl around the cabin's corners. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a sound that didn't belong, a tapping at my window. Tap, tap, tap. I rose from my chair, heart pounding. The window revealed only darkness and the swirl of snow. No branches near enough to hit the glass. Nothing that could explain the sound. Tap, tap, tap. The sound moved to another window. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the yard, catching nothing but pristine, undisturbed snow. No footprints, no animals, nothing. Then I heard it, a voice carried on the wind, faint but distinct. Help, please! Someone was out there in the storm. I grabbed my emergency pack, heavy coat, and rifle, standard procedure for nighttime rescues, and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit like a physical blow. Hello? I called. Park ranger, where are you? Silence answered. Then, from the direction of the lake, help me, I'm lost. The voice sounded odd, strained and hollow, like it was coming through a long pipe. But in these conditions, sound played strange tricks. Someone must have gotten caught in the sudden storm, maybe a hunter who had strayed into park boundaries. They wouldn't survive the night without shelter. I strapped on my snowshoes and began trudging toward the lake, my headlamp carving a tunnel through the darkness. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind still drove ice crystals that stung my exposed skin. After 15 minutes of difficult progress, I reached the lake's edge. The surface was partially frozen, with dark water still visible in patches. Hello? I called again. Can you hear me? The voice answered, seemingly from the center of the lake. Please, so cold. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through me. No one could be out on that partially frozen lake and survive. I played my light across the ice but saw nothing. Then I remembered Monroe's warning. Make damn sure you know who's calling before you answer. As I stood there, uncertain, I noticed something else. The night had gone completely silent. No wind, no rustling branches, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. And then, a crunch of snow behind me. I whirled around, light and rifle swinging together. Standing at the tree line, just at the edge of my light's reach, was a figure, tall and gaunt. It stood motionless, watching me. For a moment, I thought it was another ranger, or perhaps a lost hiker. I opened my mouth to call out. Then it stepped forward, and the light caught it fully. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. The figure was human-shaped, but wrong in ways that my mind struggled to process. Impossibly tall and thin, with limbs like bare winter branches. Its skin was stretched taut over a skeletal frame, gray-white like old ice. But it was the face that froze me in place. Hollow cheeks and sunken eyes that reflected my light with an animal shine. And a mouth that opened far too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. For 3 heartbeats, we stared at each other across 30 feet of moonlit snow. Then survival instinct kicked in. I fired a warning shot into the air, standard procedure for large predator encounters, and began backing toward the cabin, keeping my light trained on the figure. Didn't react to the gunshot. Instead, it tilted its head at an impossible angle as though curious. Then it spoke, and I heard that same hollow voice from before, but now I could see the words forming on its lips. "Help me!" The voice was perfect mimicry, a lost hiker's plea. But coming from that mouth, it was an obscenity. I turned and ran, abandoning all ranger protocol. The heavy snowshoes slowed me down, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I didn't look back until I reached the cabin, slamming and locking the door behind me. Through the window, I could see nothing but darkness and gently falling snow. Had I imagined it? A stress hallucination from isolation and the sudden winter storm? I spent the rest of the night with my rifle across my lap, staring at the door. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside cautiously. Fresh snow had fallen, covering any tracks. The lake was serene, partially frozen, giving no hint of the previous night's encounter. I almost convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Almost. The radio crackled to life around noon, and I reported the communications outage but said nothing about what I'd seen. What could I say that wouldn't sound like cabin fever setting in early? Instead, I requested any information on missing hikers or hunters in the area. The response was negative. No one reported missing. That afternoon, I found the tracks. They circled the cabin completely, a perfect ring in the snow, human-like footprints, but elongated and too far apart, as if made by someone with an impossibly long stride. They hadn't been there when I checked at dawn. Something had walked around my cabin while I was inside, studying it from every angle. I photographed the tracks before the wind erased them, then spent the evening researching the legends Monroe had referenced. The park's database contained historical records and anthropological notes on local indigenous beliefs, including those about the Wendigo. The stories varied, but certain elements remained consistent across different tribal accounts. The Wendigo was once human, transformed by an act of cannibalism during desperate winter hunger. Once transformed, it became a spirit of insatiable hunger, growing taller and gaunter the more it consumed, never satisfied. Some accounts claimed it could mimic human voices to lure victims. Others said it was most powerful during winter storms. As I read deeper into the historical records, I found accounts from the early Park Service years, incidents logged as unexplained disappearances or probable exposure deaths that followed a pattern. They occurred during the harshest winter months, often during or immediately after storms. The missing were never found, or if they were, the reports contained disturbing notes about the condition of the remains. A journal entry from 1937, written by a ranger stationed at what would later become Wapiti Ridge Outpost, caught my attention. Second missing hiker this month. Found his camp 5 miles east of the outpost. No signs of struggle, but no tracks leading away either, despite fresh snow. Strange marks on nearby trees like claw marks, but too high up for any bear. Sullivan insists it's just a grizzly, but I've never seen a bear that could reach 15 feet up a trunk. Not going to put this in the official report. They already think I'm losing my mind out here. The entry was the last one from that ranger. A note in the file indicated he himself went missing 2 weeks later during a December blizzard. That night, the temperature dropped again. I stoked the fire and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. Around midnight, the wind picked up, drowning out all other sounds with its moaning through the pines. I was nearly asleep when I heard it, a scratching at the door. Gentle at first, then more insistent. "Let me in," came a voice from outside. Not the hollow voice from the lake, but a perfect imitation of Monroe's gruff tones. "Got caught in the storm. Radio's down." My blood ran cold. Monroe was stationed 45 miles away. There was no way he would be at my door in the middle of a snowstorm, and if he somehow was, he would identify himself properly over the radio first. "I know you're in there," the voice continued, shifting subtly, becoming more strained. "Please, so hungry." The scratching became pounding, the whole door shaking in its frame. I backed away, rifle raised, as the pounding moved from the door to the windows, circling the cabin just as those tracks had circled it. I caught glimpses of a tall, emaciated figure through the glass. There one moment, gone the next, as it moved with unnatural speed. Then silence fell. I waited, barely breathing for long minutes. Had it given up? A new sound broke the silence, a long, drawn-out creak from above. Something was on the roof. Slow, deliberate footsteps tracked across the ceiling, stopping directly above me. Then a scratching at the chimney. I glanced at the wood stove with horror, realizing the flue was open. Something scraped inside the metal chimney pipe, working its way down. I didn't hesitate. I closed the flue, trapping whatever was in there, and piled more logs into the already blazing stove. The metal began to glow red-hot as an inhuman shriek erupted from within the chimney, rising into the night like a steam whistle. The scratching became frantic, then receded upward. I heard thrashing on the roof, then silence again. The attack confirmed everything. This was no hallucination, no stress-induced paranoia. Something was out there, hunting me, and it was smart enough to try different approaches. I didn't sleep that night, or much of the next day. I documented everything in my journal and on my camera, knowing how insane it would sound to anyone who hadn't experienced it. The storm continued, making any attempt to hike out suicide. I was trapped with this thing for at least 3 more days, according to the weather forecast. On the 3rd night, I was prepared. Extra firewood stacked by the stove, rifle cleaned and loaded, flares ready by the door. But the attack I expected never came. Instead, something far worse happened. As the wind died down around midnight, I heard a sound that made my heart stop, a human voice crying out weakly from the direction of the lake. "Is anyone there? Please, I think I'm lost." It wasn't the hollow voice from before. This sounded genuinely human, a woman's voice, frightened and in pain. "My leg. I fell through the ice. Please." I knew what the legend said. I knew what had happened before. But what if I was wrong? What if there really was someone out there dying while I cowered in my cabin? As a park ranger, I had sworn to protect visitors. If I let someone die because of my fear, I geared up again. Rifle, flares, extra ammunition, emergency medical kit, and stepped out into the night, determined to get to the bottom of this once and for all. The night was clear, the storm having finally blown itself out. Moonlight transformed the landscape into a realm of silver and shadow. The temperature had plummeted even further, turning the air itself into something brittle that cracked with each breath. I moved cautiously toward the lake, scanning constantly, my rifle ready. The voice had fallen silent, but I continued forward, drawn by duty and a need to face whatever had been tormenting me. The lake's surface had frozen completely now, a sheet of black ice under the moonlight. I played my light across it, searching for any sign of a break or a stranded hiker. "Hello?" I called out, my voice small in the vast silence. The response came from behind me. "Thank you for coming." I spun around, raising my rifle in one fluid motion. Standing 10 feet away was a young woman in tattered hiking gear, her face pale with cold, dark hair framing a face both beautiful and desperate. "I've been lost for days," she said, taking a step toward me, limping slightly. "My friend and I got separated in the storm." Every instinct screamed danger, but she looked so human, so vulnerable. I kept my rifle raised. "Stay where you are," I commanded. "What's your name? When did you enter the park?" Rachel, she said, her voice breaking. Rachel Moore, we came in through the eastern trailhead last week. Please, my friend might still be out there. The name wasn't familiar from any hiking permits I'd processed, but that didn't mean anything. She could have entered from another station's jurisdiction. Are you hurt? I asked, still keeping my distance. I fell through the ice, she gestured toward the lake. Managed to pull myself out, but my leg... She took another limping step forward. Stop, I warned. Don't come any closer. Something flickered across her face, a brief expression too quick to identify. Annoyance? Hunger? You don't believe me, she said softly. You think I'm... something else? I don't know what to believe anymore, I admitted. But I know something's been trying to get into my cabin for 3 nights, something that can mimic voices. She nodded slowly. It followed us, hunted us, got my friend 2 days ago. I've been hiding, trying to stay alive. Her eyes welled with tears. Please, I'm real, I'm human. I wanted to believe her, but how could I be sure? If you're human, I said, then you won't mind waiting right there while I radio this in. I reached for the radio at my belt, keeping my eyes on her. Her expression changed instantly. The tears vanished, and her mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally sharp in the moonlight. You were almost perfect, I whispered, raising my rifle. Hunger makes us clumsy, the thing wearing the shape of a woman said, its voice transforming into that hollow, pipe-like sound I'd heard before. But patient, so patient. It began to change before my eyes, limbs elongating, skin stretching and paling, until the creature from the first night stood before me again, the Wendigo in its true form. We have been here always, it said, its jaw unhinging to accommodate its words. Long before your parks, long before your kind claimed these mountains, the hunger came with the first winter. It never leaves. It stepped toward me, moving with a fluid grace that belied its skeletal appearance. I fired. The shot echoed across the frozen landscape. The creature staggered, but didn't fall. Where the bullet had struck, its flesh simply rippled like water before returning to its previous form. We cannot be killed by your weapons, it said, advancing again. We are the winter itself, the hunger that walks. I fired again, backing toward the cabin. The creature kept coming. I dropped the rifle and pulled out a flare, my last desperate plan. The legends all mentioned one vulnerability, fire. The flare ignited with a hiss, casting an angry red glow across the snow. The Wendigo stopped, its expression changing to something like fear for the first time. Fire remembers what we once were, it hissed, backing away from the flame, before the hunger changed us. I advanced on it now, flare extended. Leave this place, I demanded, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Find your prey elsewhere. The creature regarded me with ancient eyes. The hunger never ends, it said simply. When your fire dies, I will return. When your summer comes, I will sleep. But winter always returns to these mountains. And I with it. It retreated further, melting into the shadows of the tree line. Just before it disappeared, it spoke one last time. Until the next storm, Ranger. Then it was gone, leaving me alone with the guttering flare and the vast, frozen silence. I survived 3 more months at Wapiti Ridge Outpost. The Wendigo returned with each major storm, testing the boundaries I had established with fire and flares. I learned its patterns, its limitations. I documented everything, though I knew my official reports contained only the barest hints of the truth. When spring finally came, bringing with it the first replacement rangers and supply drops, I turned in my badge. No explanation would suffice for what I had experienced. Some terrors can't be communicated, only survived. I never returned to Glacier National Park, but I carry its lessons with me. In the deepest winter nights, when the wind howls around the corners of my house in Missoula, I sometimes hear that hollow voice calling for help, and I remember what Monroe told me on my first day: make damn sure you know who's calling before you answer, because some hungers never die. They only wait for the snow to fall again.